Hey everybody, we are back for session 3 of the book reading. This has been going pretty well for the past couple of sessions. I was having a lot of fun with it, and actually I was really tempted to do another reading yesterday, but I decided that my voice actually needed a bit of a rest. I'd done a couple of 2-hour sessions in a row over the previous couple of days, and doing that every day does a number on the voice. Kind of gotta save a little bit of it for the music. But I've had a day of rest, and so we're back again with Pawn of Prophecy. This is book 1 of the Belgariad, one of my favorite fantasy series that I read as a kid, and have read on and off again over the years. You know, usually every year or two I'll give it another read. It's been 5 or 6 years since I've read it this last time, so I've really been enjoying going through it again. So without further ado, we read up to the end of chapter 10, I think. Oh, I thought we did 11, but apparently not. So we're going to be starting with chapter 11 today. I'm going to have to change my notes there. If you'll recall, we left on a little bit of a cliffhanger. Chapter 11. There were 9 days on the coast road from Kamar to the capital at Sendar, though it was only 55 leagues. Captain Brendig measured their pace carefully, and his detachment of soldiers was arranged in such a fashion that even the thought of escape was impossible. Although it had stopped snowing, the road was still difficult, and the wind which blew in off the sea and across the broad, snow-covered salt marshes was raw and chill. They stayed each night in the evenly spaced Sendarian hostels, which looked like mileposts along that uninhabited stretch of coast. The hostels were not quite so well as appointed as their toned counterparts along the Great North Road, but they were at least adequate. Captain Brendig seemed solicitous about their comfort, but he also posted guards each night. On the evening of the second day, Garion sat near the fire with Dernick, staring moodily into the flames. Dernick was his oldest friend, and Garion felt a desperate need for friendship just then. "Dernick," he said finally. "Yes, lad? Have you ever been in a dungeon?" "What could I have done to be put in a dungeon? I thought you might have seen one sometime." "Honest folk don't go near such places," Dernick said. "I've heard they're awful, dark and cold and full of rats." "What's this talk of dungeons?" Dernick asked. "I'm afraid we may find out all about places like that very soon," Garion said, trying not to sound too frightened. "We've done nothing wrong," Dernick said. "Then why would the king have us all seized like this? Kings don't do things like that without good reason." "We haven't done anything wrong," Dernick repeated stubbornly. "But maybe Mr. Wolf has," Garion suggested. "The king wouldn't send all these soldiers after him without some reason, and we could all be thrown in the dungeon with him just because we happen to be his companions." "Things like that don't happen in Sendaria," Dernick said firmly. The next day the wind was very strong as it blew in off the sea, but it was a warm wind, and the foot-deep snow on the road began to turn slushy. By midday it had started to rain. They rode in sodden misery toward the next hostel. "I'm afraid we'll have to delay our journey until this blows out," Captain Brendig said that evening, looking out of one of the tiny windows of the hostel. "The road's going to be quite impassable by morning." They spent the next day, and the next, sitting in the cramped main room of the hostel listening to the wind-driven rain slashing the walls and roof, all the while under the watchful eyes of Brendig and his soldiers. "Silk," Garion said on the second day, moving over to the bench where the rat-faced little man sat dozing. "Yes, Garion?" Silk asked, rousing himself. "What kind of man is the king?" "Which king?" "Of Sendaria." "A foolish man, like all kings," Silk laughed. "The Sendarian kings are perhaps a bit more foolish, but that's only natural. Why do you ask?" "Well," Garion hesitated, "let's suppose that somebody did something that the king didn't like, and there were other people traveling with him, and the king had these people seized. Would the king just throw them all into the dungeon, or would he let the others go and just keep the one who'd angered him?" Silk looked at him for a moment and then spoke firmly. "That question's unworthy of you, Garion." Garion flushed. "I'm afraid of dungeons," he said in a small voice, suddenly very ashamed of himself. "I don't want to be locked up in the dark forever when I don't even know what for." "The kings of Sendaria are just and honest men," Silk told him. "Not too bright, I'm afraid, but always fair." "How can they be kings if they aren't wise?" Garion objected. "Wisdom's a useful trait in a king," Silk said, "but hardly essential. How did they get to be kings then? Garion demanded. Some are born to it, Sulk said. Stupidest man in the world can be a king if he has the right parents. Sendarian kings have a disadvantage because they started so low. Low? They were elected. Nobody ever elected a king before, only the Sendars. How do you elect a king? Sulk smiled. Very badly, Garion. It's a poor way to select a king. The other ways are worse, but election is a very bad way to choose a king. Tell me how it was done, Garion said. Sulk glanced briefly at the rain-spattered window across the room and shrugged. It's a way to pass the time, he said. And then he leaned back, stretched his feet toward the fire, and began. It all started about 1,500 years ago, he said, his voice loud enough to reach the ears of Captain Brendig, who sat nearby writing on a piece of parchment. Sendaria wasn't a kingdom then, or even a separate country. It had belonged from time to time to Sherrick, Elgaria, or the Northern Arons, Wastide or Asturian, depending on the fortunes of the horrendous Civil War. When that war finally came to an end and the Wastites were destroyed and the Asturians had been defeated and driven into the untracked reaches of the great northern forest of Erendia, the Emperor of Tolnadra, Ranhorb II, decided that there ought to be a kingdom there. How could a Tolnadran emperor make that kind of decision for Sendaria? Garion asked. The arm of the empire is very long, Sulk said. The Great North Road had been built during the Second Barun dynasty. I think it was Ran Barun IV who started the construction. Wasn't it, Captain? The fifth, Brendig said somewhat sourly without looking up. Ran Barun V. Thank you, Captain, Sulk said. I can never keep the Barun dynasty straight. Anyway, there were already imperial legions in Sendaria to maintain the highway, and if one has troops in an area, one has a certain authority. Wouldn't you say, Captain? It's your story, Brendig said shortly. Indeed it is, Sulk agreed. Now, it wasn't really out of any kind of generosity that Ranhorb made this decision, Garion. Don't misunderstand that. Tolnadrans never give anything away. It was just that the Membrate Arons had finally won the Erendish Civil War, 1,000 years of bloodshed and treachery, and Tolnadra couldn't afford to allow the Membrates to expand into the north. The creation of an independent kingdom in Sendaria would block Membrate access to the trade routes down out of Drasnia, and prevent the seat of world power from moving to Vomembra, and leaving the imperial capital at Tulhaneth in a kind of backwater. It all sounds terribly involved, Garion said. Not really, Sulk said. It's only politics, and that's a very simple game, isn't it, Captain? A game I do not play, Brendig said, not looking up. Really? Sulk asked. So long at court, not a politician. You're a rare man, Captain. At any rate, the Sendars suddenly discovered that they had themselves a kingdom, but they had no genuine hereditary nobility. Oh, there were a few retired Tolnadran nobles living on estates here and there, assorted pretenders to this or that Wasite Asturian title. A Sherrick war chief or two with a few followers, but no genuine Sendarian nobility. And so it was they decided to hold a national election, select a king, don't you see, and then leave the bestowing of titles up to him. Very practical approach, and typically Sendarian. How do you elect a king? Garion asked, beginning to lose his dread of dungeons in his fascination with the story. Everybody votes, Sulk said simply. Parents, of course, probably cast the votes of their children, but it appears there was very little cheating. The rest of the world stood around and laughed at all this foolishness, but the Sendars continued to cast ballot after ballot for 12 years. 6 years, actually, Brendig said with his face still down over the parchment. 3827 to 3833. And there were over 1,000 candidates, Sulk said expansively. 743, Brendig said tightly. I stand corrected, noble captain, Sulk said. It's an enormous comfort to have such an expert here to catch my errors. I'm but a simple Drasnian merchant with little background in history. Anyway, on the 23rd ballot, they finally elected their king, a rutabaga farmer named Fundor. He raised more than just rutabagas, Brendig said, looking up with an angry face. Of course he did, Sulk said, smacking his forehead with an open palm. How could I have forgotten the cabbages? He raised cabbages too, Garion. Never forget the cabbages. Well, everybody in Sendaria who thought he was important journeyed to Fundor's farm and found him vigorously fertilizing his fields, and they greeted him with a great cry, Hail Fundor the Magnificent, King of Sendaria, and fell on their knees in his august presence. Must we continue with this? Brendig asked in a pained voice, looking up. The boy wants to know, Captain, Sulk replied with an innocent face. It's our duty as his elders to instruct him in the history of our past, wouldn't you say? Say whatever you like, Brendig said in a stiff voice. Thank you for your permission, Captain, Sulk said, inclining his head. Do you know what the King of Sendaria said then, Garion? He asked. No, Garion said. What? I pray you, your eminences, the king said, have a care for your finery. I've just well manured the bed in which you're kneeling. Beric, who was sitting nearby, roared with laughter, pounding his knee with one huge hand. "I find this less than amusing, sir," Captain Brendig said coldly, rising to his feet. "I make no jokes about the King of Drasnia, do I?" "You're a courteous man, Captain," Silk said mildly, "and a nobleman. I'm merely a poor man trying to make his way in the world." Brendig looked at him helplessly and then turned and stamped from the room. The following morning the wind had blown itself out and the rain had stopped. The road was very nearly a quagmire, but Brendig decided they must continue. Travel that day was difficult, and the next was somewhat easier as the road began to drain. Aunt Paul seemed unconcerned by the fact that they'd been seized at the king's orders. She maintained her regal bearing even though Garion saw no real need to continue the subterfuge, and wished fervently that she would abandon it. The familiar practical sensibility with which she'd ruled her kitchen at Feldor's farm had somehow been replaced by a kind of demanding willfulness that Garion found particularly distressing. For the first time in his life he felt a distance between them, and it left a vacancy that had never been there before. To make matters worse, the gnawing uncertainty which had been steadily growing since Silk's unequivocal declaration on the hilltop outside of Winold that Aunt Paul could not possibly be his aunt, sawed roughly at his own sense of his identity, and Garion often found himself staring at the awful question, "Who am I?" Mr. Wolfe seemed changed as well. He seldom spoke, either on the road nor at night at the hostels. He spent a great deal of time sitting by himself with an expression of moody irritability on his face. Finally, on the 9th day after their departure from Kamar, the broad salt marshes ended, and the land along the coast became more rolling. They topped a hill about midday just as the pale winter sun broke through the clouds, and there in the valley below them, the walled city of Sendar lay facing the sea. The detachment of guards at the south gate of the city saluted smartly as Captain Brendig led the little party through, and he returned the salute crisply. The broad streets of the city seemed filled with people in the finest clothing, all moving about importantly as if their errands were the most vital in the world. "Courtiers," Beric, who chanced to be riding beside Garion, snorted with contempt. "Not a real man among them." "A necessary evil, my dear Beric," Silk said back over his shoulder to the big man. "Little jobs require little men, and it's the little jobs that keep a kingdom running." After they passed through a magnificently large square, they moved up a wide avenue to the palace. It was a very large building with many stories and broad wings extending out on each side of the paved courtyard. The entire structure was surmounted by a round tower that was easily the highest edifice in the whole city. "Where do you suppose the dungeons are?" Garion whispered to Dernick when they stopped. "I take it most kindly, Garion," Dernick said with a pained look, "if you would not speak so much of dungeons." Captain Brendig dismounted and went to meet a fussy-looking man in an embroidered tunic and feathered cap, who came down the wide steps in front of the palace to meet them. They spoke for a few moments and seemed to be arguing. "My orders are from the king himself," Brendig said, his voice carrying to where they sat. "I'm commanded to deliver these people directly to him immediately upon our arrival." "My orders are also from the king," the fussy-looking man said, "and I am commanded to have them made presentable before they're delivered to the throne room. I'll take charge of them." "They will remain in my custody, Count Nilden, until they've been delivered to the king himself," Brendig said coldly. "I'll not have your muddy soldiers tracking through the halls of the palace, Lord Brendig," the count replied. "Then we'll wait here, Count Nilden," Brendig said. Be so good as to fetch his majesty." "Fetch!" The count's face was aghast. "I'm chief butler to his majesty's household, Lord Brendig. I do not fetch anything or anybody." Brendig turned, as if to remount his horse. "Oh, very well," Count Nilden said petulantly. "If you must have it your own way, at least have them wipe their feet." Brendig bowed coldly. "I won't forget this, Lord Brendig," Nilden threatened. "Nor shall I, Count Nilden," Brendig replied. Then they all dismounted, and, with Brendig's soldiers drawn up in close order about them, they crossed to the courtyard, to a broad door near the centre of the west wing. "Be so good as to follow me," Count Nilden said, glancing with a shudder at the mud-spattered soldiers, and he led them into the wide corridor which lay beyond the door. Apprehension and curiosity struggled in Garion's mind. Despite the assurances of Silk and Dernick, and the hopeful implications at Count Nilden's announcement that he was going to have them made presentable, the threat of some clammy, rat-infested dungeon, complete with a rack and a wheel and other unpleasant things, still seemed very real. On the other hand, he'd never been in a palace before, and his eyes tried to be everywhere at once. That part of his mind which sometimes spoke to him in a dry detachment told him that his fears were probably groundless, and that his gawking made him appear to be a doltish country bumpkin. Count Nilden led them directly to a part of the corridor where there were a number of highly polished doors. "This one's for the boy," he announced, pointing at one of them. One of the soldiers opened the door, and Garion reluctantly stepped through, looking back over his shoulder at Aunt Paul. "Come along now," a somewhat impatient voice said. Garion whirled, not knowing what to expect. "Close the door, boy," the fine-looking man who'd been waiting for him said. "We don't have all day, you know." The man was waiting beside a large wooden tub with steam rising from it. "Quickly, boy, take off those filthy rags and get into the tub. His Majesty is waiting." Too confused to object or even answer, Garion numbly began to unlace his tunic. After he'd been bathed and the knots had been brushed out of his hair, he was dressed in clothes which lay on a nearby bench. His coarse woolen hose of serviceable peasant brown were exchanged for ones of much finer weave in a lustrous blue. His scuffed and muddy boots were traded for soft leather shoes. His tunic was soft white linen, and the doublet he wore over it was a rich blue trimmed with a silvery fur. "I guess that's the best I can do on short notice," the man who'd bathed and dressed him said, looking him up and down critically. "At least I won't be totally embarrassed when you're presented to the king." Garion mumbled his thanks and then stood, waiting for further instructions. "Well, go along, boy, you mustn't keep His Majesty waiting." Silk and Beric stood in the corridor, talking quietly. Beric was hugely splendid in a green brocade doublet, but looked uncomfortable without his sword. Silk's doublet was a rich black, trimmed in silver, and his scraggly whiskers had been carefully trimmed into an elegant short beard. "What does all of this mean?" Garion asked as he joined them. "We're to be presented to the king," Beric said, "and our honest clothes might have given offense. Kings aren't accustomed to looking at ordinary men." Dernick emerged from one of the rooms, his face pale with anger. "That overdressed fool wanted to give me a bath," he said in choked outrage. "It's a custom," Silk explained. "Noble guests aren't expected to bathe themselves. I hope you didn't hurt him." "I'm not a noble, and I'm quite able to bathe myself," Dernick said hotly. "I told him I'd drown him in his own tub if he didn't keep his hands to himself. After that he didn't pester me anymore, but he did steal my clothes. I had to put these on instead." He gestured at his clothes, which were quite similar to Garion's. "I hope no one sees me in all this frippery." "Beric says the king might be offended if he saw us in our real clothes," Garion told him. "The king won't be looking at me," Dernick said, "and I don't like this business of trying to look like something I'm not. I'll wait outside with the horses if I can get my own clothes back." "Be patient, Dernick," Beric advised. "We'll get this business with the king straightened out, then we'll be on our way again." If Dernick was angry, Mr. Wolf was in what could be best described as a towering fury. He came out into the corridor dressed in a snowy white robe, deeply cowled at the back. "Someone's going to pay for this," he raged. "It does become you," Silk said admiringly. "Your taste has always been questionable, Master Silk," Wolf said in a frosty tone. "Where's Paul?" "The lady has not yet made her appearance," Silk said. "Should have known," Wolf said, sitting down on a nearby bench. "We may as well be comfortable. Paul's preparations usually take quite a while." And so they waited. Captain Brendig, who changed his boots and doublet, paced up and down as the minutes dragged by. Garion was totally baffled by the reception. They didn't seem to be under arrest, but his imagination still saw dungeons, and that was enough to make him very jumpy. And then Aunt Paul appeared. She wore the blue velvet gown that had been made for her in Kamar, and a silver circlet about her head which set off the single white lock at her brow. Her bearing was regal and her face stern. "So soon, Mistress Paul?" Wolf asked dryly. "I hope you weren't rushed." She ignored that and examined each of them in turn. "Adequate, I suppose," she said finally, absently adjusting the collar of Garion's doublet. "Give me your arm, old wolf, and let's find out what the king of the Cendars wants with us." Mr. Wolf rose from the bench, extended his arm, and the two of them started down the corridor. Captain Brendig hastily assembled his soldiers and followed them all in some kind of ragged order. "If you please, my lady," he called out to Aunt Paul, "permit me to show you the way." "We know the way, Lord Brendig," she replied without so much as turning her head. Count Nilden, the chief butler, stood waiting for them in front of two massive doors guarded by uniformed men-at-arms. He bowed slightly to Aunt Paul and snapped his fingers. The men-at-arms swung the heavy doors inward. Fulrock, the king of Sendaria, was a dumpy-looking man with a short brown beard. He sat rather uncomfortably, it appeared, on a high-backed throne, which stood on a dais at one end of the great hall and into which Count Nilden led them. The throne-room was vast, with a high vaulted ceiling and walls covered in what seemed like acres of heavy red velvet drapery. There were candles everywhere, and dozens of people strolled about in fine clothes and chatted idly in the corners, all but ignoring the presence of the king. May I announce you?" Count Nilden asked Mr. Wolf. "Fulrock knows who I am," Wolf replied shortly, and strode down the long scarlet carpet toward the throne, with Aunt Paul still on his arm. Garion and the others followed, with Brendig and his soldiers close behind, through the sudden quiet crowd of courtiers and their ladies. At the foot of the throne they all stopped, and Wolf bowed rather coldly. Aunt Paul, her eyes frosty, curtsied, and Beric and Silk bowed in a courtly manner. Dernick and Garion followed suit, though not nearly as gracefully. "If it please your majesty," Brendig's voice came from behind them, "these are the ones who saw it." "I knew you could be depended on, Lord Brendig," the king replied in a rather ordinary-sounding voice. "Your reputation is well deserved. You have my thanks." Then he looked at Mr. Wolf and the rest of them, his expression undecipherable. Garion began to tremble. "My dear old friend," the king said to Mr. Wolf, "it's been too many years since we last met." "Have you lost your wits entirely, Fulrock?" Mr. Wolf snapped in a voice which carried no further than the king's ears. "Why do you choose to interfere with me, now of all times? And what possessed you to outfit me in this absurd thing?" He plucked at the front of his white robe in disgust. "Are you trying to announce my presence to every Murgo from here to the Hook of Arendia?" The king's face looked pained. "I was afraid you might take it this way," he said in a voice no louder than Mr. Wolf's had been. "I'll explain when we can speak more privately." He turned quickly to Aunt Paul as if trying to preserve the appearance at least of dignity. "It's been much too long since we've seen you, dear lady. Layla and the children have missed you, and I've been desolate in your absence." "Your majesty is too kind," Aunt Paul said, her tone as cold as the wolf's. The king winced. "Pray, dear lady," he apologized, "don't judge me too hastily. My reasons were urgent. I hope that Lord Brendig's summons didn't too greatly inconvenience you." "Lord Brendig was the soul of courtesy," Aunt Paul said, her tone unchanged. She glanced once at Brendig, who'd grown visibly pale. "And you, my Lord Beric," the king hurried on as if trying to make the best of a bad situation. "How fares your cousin, our dear brother king, Anheg of Sherrick?" "He was well when last I saw him, your majesty," Beric replied formally. "A bit drunk, but that's not unusual for Anheg." The king chuckled a bit nervously and turned quickly to Silk. "Prince Keldar of the royal house of Drasnia," he said. "We're amazed to find such noble visitors in our realm, and more than a little injured that they choose not to call upon us that we might greet them. Is the king of the Sendars of so little note that he's not even worth a brief stop?" "We intended no disrespect, your majesty," Silk replied, bowing, "but our errand was of such urgency that there wasn't any time for the usual courtesies." The king flickered a warning glance at that and surprisingly wove his fingers in the scarcely perceptible gestures of the Drasnian secret language. "Not here. Too many ears about." He then looked inquiringly at Dernick and Garion. Aunt Paul stepped forward. "This is Goodman Dernick of the district of Arat, your majesty," she said. "A brave and honest man." "Welcome, Goodman Dernick," the king said. "I can only hope that men may one day call me a brave and honest man." Dernick bowed awkwardly, his face filled with bewilderment. "I'm just a simple blacksmith, your honor," he said, "but I hope all men know that I'm your honor's most loyal and devoted subject." "Well spoken, Goodman Dernick," the king said with a smile, and then he looked at Garion. Aunt Paul followed his glance. "A boy, your majesty," she said rather indifferently. "Garion by name. He was placed in my care some years ago and accompanies us because I didn't know what else to do with him." A terrible coldness struck at Garion's stomach. The certainty that her casual words were in fact the bald truth came crashing down upon him. She had not even tried to soften the blow. The indifference with which she destroyed his life hurt almost more than the destruction itself. "Also welcome, Garion," the king said. "You travel in noble company for one so young." "I didn't know who they were, your majesty," Garion said miserably. "Nobody tells me anything." The king laughed in tolerant amusement. "As you grow older, Garion," he said, "you'll probably find that during these days such innocence is the most comfortable state in which to live. I've been told things of late I'd much prefer not to know." "May we speak privately now, Fulrock?" Mr. Wolf said, his voice still irritated. "In good time, my old friend," the king replied. "I've ordered a banquet prepared in your honor. Let's all go and dine. Layla and the children are waiting for us. There will be time later to discuss certain matters." And with that he rose and stepped down from the dais. Garion, sunk in his private misery, fell in beside Silk. "Prince Keldar?" he said, desperately needing to take his mind off the shocking reality that had just fallen upon him. "An accident of birth, Garion," Silk said with a shrug. "Something over which I had no control. Fortunately, I'm only the nephew of the king of Drasnia, and far down in the line of succession. I'm not in any immediate danger of ascending the throne." "And Beric is?" "The cousin of King Anheg of Sherrick," Silk replied. He looked over his shoulder. "What is your exact rank, Beric?" he asked. The Earl of Trollheim, Beric rumbled. Why do you ask? The lad here was curious, Silk said. It's all nonsense anyway, Beric said. But when Anheg became king, someone had to become clan chief. In Sherrick, you can't be both. It's considered unlucky, particularly by the chiefs of the other clans. I can see why they might feel that way, Silk laughed. It's an empty title anyway, Beric observed. There hasn't been a clan war in Sherrick for over 3,000 years. I let my youngest brother act in my stead. He's a simple-minded fellow and easily amused. Besides, it annoys my wife. You're married? Garion was startled. If you want to call it that, Beric said sourly. Silk nudged Garion warningly, indicating this was a delicate subject. Why didn't you tell us? Garion demanded accusingly. About your titles, I mean. Would it have made any difference? Silk asked. Well, no, Garion admitted. But... He stopped, unable to put his feelings about the matter into words. I don't understand any of this, he concluded lamely. It'll all become clear in time, Silk assured him as they entered the banquet hall. The hall was almost as large as a throne room. There were long tables covered with fine linen cloth, and once again candles everywhere. A servant stood behind each chair, and everything was supervised by a plump little woman with a beaming face and a tiny crown perched precariously atop her head. As they all entered, she came forward quickly. Dear Paul, she said, you look just wonderful. She embraced Aunt Paul warmly, and the two began talking together animatedly. Queen Layla, Silk explained briefly to Garion. They call her the mother of Sandaria. The 4 children over there are hers. She has 4 or 5 others, older and probably away on state business, since Fulrock insists that his children earn their keep. It's a standard joke among the other kings that Queen Layla's been pregnant since she was 14, but that's probably because they're expected to send royal gifts at each new birth. She's a good person, though, and she keeps King Fulrock from making too many mistakes. She knows Aunt Paul, Garion said, and that fact disturbed him for some reason. Everybody knows your Aunt Paul, Silk told him. Since Aunt Paul and the Queen were deep in conversation and already drifting toward the head of the table, Garion stayed close to Silk. Don't let me make any mistakes, he gestured, trying to keep the movements of his fingers inconspicuous. Silk winked in reply. Once they were all seated and the food began to arrive, Garion began to relax. He found that all he had to do was follow Silk's lead, and the intricate niceties of formal dining no longer intimidated him. The talk around him was dignified and quite incomprehensible, but he reasoned that no one was likely to pay much attention to him, and that he was probably safe if he kept his mouth shut and his eyes on his plate. An elderly nobleman with a beautifully curled silver beard, however, leaned toward him. You've travelled recently, I'm told, he said in a somewhat condescending tone. How fares the kingdom, young man? Garion looked helplessly across the table at Silk. What do I say? He gestured with his fingers. Tell him that the kingdom fares no better nor worse than might be anticipated under the present circumstances, Silk replied. Garion dutifully repeated that. Ah, the old nobleman said. Much as I'd expected. You're a very observant boy for one so young. I enjoy talking with young people. Their views are so fresh. Who is he? Garion gestured. The Earl of Selene, Silk replied. He's a tiresome old bore, but be polite to him. Address him as my lord. And how did you find the roads? The Earl inquired. Somewhat in disrepair, my lord, Garion replied with Silk's prompting. But that's normal for this time of year, isn't it? Indeed it is, the Earl said approvingly. What a splendid boy you are. The strange three-way conversation continued, and Garion even began to enjoy himself as the comments fed to him by Silk seemed to amaze the old gentleman. At last the banquet was over, and the king rose from his seat at the head of the table. And now, dear friends, he announced, Queen Layla and I would like to visit privately with our noble guests, and so we pray you will excuse us. He offered his arm to Aunt Paul. Mr. Wolf offered his to the plump little queen, and the 4 of them walked toward the far door of the hall. The Earl of Selene smiled broadly at Garion and then looked across the table. I've enjoyed our conversation, Prince Keldar, he said to Silk. I may indeed be a tiresome old bore, as you say, but that sometimes can be an advantage, don't you think? Silk laughed ruefully. I should have known that an old fox like you would be an adept at the secret language, my lord. A legacy from a misspent youth, the Earl laughed. Your pupil is most proficient, Prince Keldar, but his accent is strange. The weather was cold while he was learning, my lord, Silk said, and our fingers were a bit stiff. I'll correct the problem when we have leisure. The old nobleman seemed enormously pleased with himself at having outsmarted Silk. Splendid boy, he said, patting Garion's shoulders. And then he went off, chuckling to himself. You knew he understood all along, Garion accused Silk. Of course, Sulk said. Drasnian intelligence knows everybody adept at our secret speech. Sometimes it's useful to permit certain carefully selected messages to be intercepted. Don't ever underestimate the Earl of Selene, however. It's not possible that he's... Hang on a second. It's not impossible that he's at least as clever as I am. But look how much he enjoyed catching us. Can't you ever do anything without being sly? Garion asked. His tone was a bit grumpy, since he was convinced that somehow he'd been the butt of the whole joke. Not unless I absolutely have to, my Garion. Sulk laughed. People such as I continually practice deception, even when it's not necessary. Our lives sometimes depend on how cunning we are, so we need to keep our wits sharp. Must be a very lonely way to live, Garion observed rather shrewdly at the silent prompting of his inner voice. You never really trust anyone, do you? I suppose not, Sulk said. It's a game we play, Garion. We're all very skilled at it. At least we are if we intend to live very long. We all know each other, since we're members of a very small profession. The rewards are great, but after a while we play our game only for the joy of defeating each other. You're right, though. It is lonely, and sometimes disgusting. But most of the time, it's a great deal of fun. Count Nilden came up to them and bowed politely. His Majesty asks that you and the boy join him and your other friends in the private apartments, Prince Keldar, he said. If he'll be so good as to follow me. Of course, Sulk said. Come along, Garion. The Sulk's private apartments were much simpler than the ornate halls of the main palace. King Fulruk had removed his crown and state robes and now looked much like any other Sendar, in rather ordinary clothes. He stood talking quietly with Beric. Queen Layla and Aunt Paul were seated on a couch deep in conversation, and Dernick was not far away, trying his best to look inconspicuous. Mr. Wolf stood alone near a window, his face like a thundercloud. Ah, Prince Keldar, the king said. We thought that perhaps you and Garion had been waylaid. We were fencing with the Earl of Selene, your majesty, Sulk said lightly. Figuratively speaking, of course. Be careful of him, the king cautioned. It's quite possible he's too shrewd even for one of your talents. I've a great deal of respect for the old scoundrel, Sulk laughed. King Fulruk glanced apprehensively at Mr. Wolf and squared his shoulders and sighed. I suppose we'd better get this unpleasantness over with, he said. Layla, would you entertain our other guests while I give our grim-faced old friend here and the lady the opportunity to scold me? It's obvious he's not going to be happy until they said a few unkind things to me about some matters that weren't really my fault. Of course, dear, Queen Layla said. Try not to be too long, and please don't shout. The children have been put to bed and they need their rest. Aunt Paul rose from the couch, and she and Mr. Wolf, whose expression hadn't changed, followed the king into an adjoining chamber. Well then, Queen Layla said pleasantly, what should we talk about? I'm instructed, your highness, to convey the regards of Queen Porén of Drasnia to you should the occasion arise, Sulk said in a courtly manner. She asks leave of you to broach a correspondence on a matter of some delicacy. Why, of course, Queen Layla beamed. She's a dear child, far too pretty and sweet-natured for that fat old bandit Rodar. I hope he hasn't made her unhappy. No, your highness, Sulk said. Amazing though it may seem, she loves my uncle to distraction, and he, of course, is delirious with joy over so young and beautiful a wife. It's positively sickening the way they dote on each other. Some day, Prince Keldar, you will fall in love, the queen said with a little smirk, and the 12 kingdoms will stand around and chortle over the fall of so notorious a bachelor. What's this matter Porén wishes to discuss with me? It's a question of fertility, your highness, Sulk said with a delicate cough. She wants to present my uncle with an heir, and she needs to seek your advice in the business. The entire world stands in awe of your gifts in that particular area. Queen Layla blushed prettily and then laughed. I'll write to her at once, she promised. Garion by now had carefully worked his way to the door through which King Fulruk had taken Aunt Paul and Mr. Wolf. He began a meticulous examination of a tapestry on the wall to conceal the fact that he was trying to hear what was going on behind the closed door. It took him only a moment to begin to pick up familiar voices. Exactly what does all of this foolishness mean, Fulruk? Mr. Wolf was saying. Please don't judge me too hastily, Ancient One, the king said placatingly. Some things have happened that you might not be aware of. You know I'm aware of everything that happens, Wolf said. Did you know that we're defenseless if the Accursed One awakens? That which held him in check has been stolen off of the throne of the Riving King. As a matter of fact, I was following the trail of the thief when your noble Captain Brendig interrupted me in my search. I'm sorry, Fulruk said, but you wouldn't have gone much farther anyway. All of the kings of Eloria have been searching for you for 3 months now. Your likeness, drawn by the finest artists, is in the hands of every ambassador, agent, and official of the 5 kingdoms of the north. Actually, you've been followed since you left Darien. Fulrock, I'm busy. Tell the Alorn kings to leave me alone. Why are they all suddenly so interested in my movements? They want to have counsel with you, the king said. The Alorns are preparing for war, and even my poor Sendaria is being quietly mobilized. If the accursed one arises now, we're all doomed. The power that's been stolen can very possibly be used to awaken him, and his first move will be to attack the west. You know that, Belgariad. And you also know that until the return of the Riven King, the west has no real defense. Garion blinked and started violently, then tried to cover the sudden movement by bending to look at some of the finer detail on the tapestry. He told himself that he had heard wrong. The name King Fulrock had spoken could not have really been Belgariad. Belgariad was a fairy tale figure, just a myth. Just tell the Alorn kings that I'm in pursuit of the thief, Mr. Wolf said. I don't have time for counsels just now. If they'll leave me alone, I should be able to catch up with him before he can do any mischief with the thing he's managed to steal. Don't tempt fate, Fulrock, Aunt Paul advised. Your interference is costing us time we can't afford to lose. Presently I'll become vexed with you. The king's voice was firm as he answered. I know your power, Lady Polgara, he said. And Garion jumped again. I don't have any choice, however, the king continued. I'm bound by my word to deliver you all up at Val-Alorn to the kings of Valoria, and a king can't break his word to other kings. There was a long silence in the other room while Garion's mind raced through a dozen possibilities. You're not a bad man, Fulrock, Mr. Wolf said. Not perhaps as bright as I might wish, but a good man nonetheless. I won't raise my hand against you, nor will my daughter. Speak for yourself, old wolf, Aunt Paul said grimly. No, Polgara, he said. If we have to go to Val-Alorn, let's go with all possible speed. The sooner we explain things to the Alorns, the sooner they'll stop interfering. I think age is beginning to soften your brain, Father, Aunt Paul said. We don't have the time for this excursion to Val-Alorn. Fulrock can explain to the Alorn kings. It won't do any good, Lady Polgara, the king said rather ruefully. As your father so pointedly mentioned, I'm not considered very bright. The Alorn kings won't listen to me. If you leave now, they'll just send someone like Brendig to apprehend you again. Then that unfortunate man may suddenly find himself living out the remainder of his days as a toad, or possibly a radish, Aunt Paul said ominously. Enough of that, Paul, Mr. Wolf said. Is there a ship ready, Fulrock? It lies at the North Wharf, Belgariad, the king replied. A Sherrick vessel sent by King Aneg. Very well, Mr. Wolf said. Tomorrow, then, we'll go to Sherrick. It seems that I'm going to have to point out a few things to some thick-headed Alorns. Will you be going with us? I'm obliged to, Fulrock said. The council's to be general, and Sendaria is involved. You haven't heard the last of this, Fulrock, Aunt Paul said. Never mind, Paul, Mr. Wolf said. He's only doing what he thinks is right. We'll straighten it all out of Val-Alorn. In Val-Alorn. Garion was trembling as he stepped away from the door. It was impossible. His skeptical Sendarian upbringing made him at first incapable of even considering such an absurdity. Reluctantly, however, he finally forced himself to look the idea fully in the face. What if Mr. Wolf really was Belgariad the Sorcerer, a man who'd lived for over 7,000 years? And what if Aunt Paul was really his daughter, Polgara the Sorceress, who was only slightly younger? All the bits and pieces, the cryptic hints, the half-truths fell together. Silk had been right. She couldn't be his aunt. Garion's orphanage was complete now. He was adrift in the world with no ties of blood or heritage to cling to. Desperately he wanted to go home, back to Faldor's farm, where he could sink himself into unthinking obscurity in a quiet place, where there were no sorcerers or strange searches, or anything that could even remind him of Aunt Paul and the cruel hoax she'd made of his life. Thus ends part 1. Just going to scroll down quickly and see if there were any comments. Lots of folks joining, though. Folks popping in and out. Looks like there's just a handful of us still watching, but as long as there's somebody paying attention, I'll keep reading until my voice gives out anyway. I'm guessing the majority of folks were kind of popping in to see if it was a music session. This is something that appeals to a smaller crowd of folks, but the folks who do seem to like it seem to really like it, so. We're moving on to part 2, Sherrick. And there's a map of the kingdom of Sherrick where it meets up with Sendaria. myself comfortable here. Chapter 12. In the first grey light of the early morning, they rode through the quiet streets of Sendar, to the harbour in their waiting ship. The finery of the evening before had been put aside, and they had all resumed their customary clothes. Even King Fulrock and the Earl of Selene had donned plain garb, and now resembled nothing quite so much as two moderately prosperous Sendars on a business trip. Queen Layla, who was not to go with them, rode beside her husband, talking earnestly to him with an expression on her face that seemed almost to hover on the verge of tears. The party was accompanied by soldiers, cloaked against the raw, chill wind off the sea. At the foot of the street led down from the palace to the harbour. The stone wharves of the Sendars jutted out into the choppy water, and there, rocking and straining against the hawsers which held her, was their ship. She was a lean vessel, narrow of beam and high-prowed, with a kind of wolfish appearance that did little to quiet Garion's nervousness about his first sea voyage. Lounging about on her deck were a number of savage-looking sailors, bearded and garbed in shaggy garments made of fur. With the exception of Beric, these were the first Sheriks Garion had ever seen, and his first impression was that they would probably prove to be totally unreliable. "Beric!" A burly man halfway up the mast shouted and dropped hand over hand down a steeply slanting slope to the deck, and then jumped across to the wharf. "Greldick!" Beric roared in response, swung down from his horse and clasped the evil-looking sailor in a bear hug. "It would seem that Lord Beric is acquainted with our captain," the Earl of Selene observed. "That's disquieting," Silk said wryly. "I was hoping for a sober, sensible captain of middle years and a conservative disposition. I'm not fond of ships and sea travel to begin with." "I'm told that Captain Greldick is one of the finest seamen in all of Sherik," the Earl assured him. "My lord," Silk said with a pained look, "Sherik definitions can be deceptive." Sourly he watched Beric and Greldick toasting the reunion with tankards of ale that had been passed down to them from the ship by a grinning sailor. Queen Layla had dismounted and she embraced Aunt Paul. "Please watch out for my poor husband, Paul," she said with a little laugh that quivered a bit. "Don't let those Alorn bullies goad him into doing anything foolish." "Of course, Layla," Aunt Paul said comfortingly. "Now, Layla," King Fulrock said in an embarrassed voice, "I'll be all right. I'm a grown man, after all." The plump little queen wiped her eyes. "I want you to promise to wear warm clothes," she said, "and not to sit up all night drinking with Anheg." "We're on serious business, Layla," the king said. "There won't be time for any of that." "I know Anheg too well," the queen sniffed. She turned to Mr. Wolf, stood on her tiptoes and kissed his bearded cheek. "Dear Belgarath," she said, "when this is over, promise that you and Paul will come back for a long visit." "I promise, Layla," Mr. Wolf said gravely. "The tide's turning, Lord King," Greldick said, "and my ship is growing restless." "Oh dear," the queen said. She put her arms around the king's neck and buried her face in his shoulders. Now, Fulrock said awkwardly. "If you don't go now, I'm going to cry right here in public," she said, pushing him away. The stones of the wharf were slippery, and the slim Sherik ship bobbed and rolled in the chop. The narrow plank they had to cross heaved and swayed dangerously, but they all managed to board without incident. The sailors slipped the hawsers and took their places at the oars. The lean vessel leapt away from the wharf and moved swiftly into the harbour past the stout and bulky merchantmen anchored nearby. Queen Layla stood forlornly on the wharf, surrounded by tall soldiers. She waved a few times and then stood watching, her chin lifted bravely. Captain Greldig took his place at the tiller, with Beric by his side, and signalled to a squat, muscular warrior crouched nearby. The squat man nodded and pulled a ragged square of sailcloth off of a high-topped drum. He began a slow beat, and the oarsmen immediately took up the rhythm. The ship surged ahead and made for the open sea. Once they were beyond the protection of the harbour, the swells grew so ponderous that the ship no longer rocked, but ran instead down the back of each wave and up the face of the next. The long oars, dipping to the rhythm of the sullen drum, left little swirls on the surface of the waves. The sea was lead-grey beneath the wintry sky, and the low, snow-covered coastline of Sendaria slid by on the right, bleak and desolate-looking. Garion spent most of the day shivering in a sheltered spot near the high prow, moodily staring out at the sea. The shards and shambles into which his life had fallen the night before lay in ruins about him. The idea that Wolf was Belgarath and Aunt Paul was Polgara was of course an absurdity. He was convinced, however, that a part of the whole thing at least was true. She might not be Polgara, but she was almost certainly not his aunt. He avoided looking at her as much as possible, and didn't speak to anyone. They slept that night in cramped quarters beneath the stern deck of the ship. Mr. Wolfe was talking for a long time with King Fulrock and the Earl of Selene. Darian covertly watched the old man, whose silvery hair and short-cropped beard seemed almost to glow in the light from a swinging oil lamp hanging from one of the low beams. He still looked the same as always, and Darian finally turned over and went to sleep. The next day they rounded the hook of Sandaria and beat northeasterly, with a good following wind. The sails were raised, and the oarsmen were able to rest. Darian continued to wrestle with his problem. On the third day out, the weather turned stormy and bitterly cold. The rigging crackled with ice, and sleet hissed into the sea around them. "If this doesn't break, it'll be a rough passage through the bore," Beric said, frowning into the sleet. "The what?" Dernick asked apprehensively. Dernick wasn't at all comfortable on the ship. He was just recovering from a bout of seasickness, and he was obviously a bit edgy. "The Sherrick Bore," Beric explained. "It's a passage about a league wide between the northern tip of Sandaria and the southern end of the Sherrick Peninsula. Riptides, whirlpools, that kind of thing. Don't be alarmed, Dernick. This is a good ship, and Greldick knows the secret of navigating the bore. It may be a bit rough, but we'll be perfectly safe. Unless we're unlucky, of course." "That's a cheery thing to say," Silk observed dryly from nearby. "I've been trying for 3 days not to think about the bore." "Is it really that bad?" Dernick asked in a sinking voice. "I make a special point of not going through it sober," Silk told him. Beric laughed. "You ought to be thankful for the bore, Silk," he said. "It keeps the Empire out of the Gulf of Sherrick. All Drasnia would be a Tolnadron province if it weren't there." "I admire it politically," Silk said, "but personally I'd be much happier if I never had to look at it again." On the following day they anchored near the rocky coast of northern Sandaria and waited for the tide to turn. In time it slackened and reversed, and the waters of the Sea of the Winds mounted and plunged through the bore to raise the level of the Gulf of Sherrick. "Find something solid to hold on to, Darian," Beric advised as Greldick ordered the anchor raised. "With this following wind, the passage could be interesting." He strode along the narrow deck, his teeth gleaming in a broad grin. It was foolish, Darian knew that, even as he stood up and began to follow the red-bearded man toward the prow. But 4 days of solitary brooding over a problem that refused to yield to any kind of logic made him feel almost belligerently reckless. He set his teeth together and took hold of a rusted iron ring embedded in the prow. Beric laughed and clapped him a stunning blow on the shoulder. "Good boy," he said approvingly. "We'll stand together and look the bore right down the throat." Darian decided not to answer that. With wind and tide behind her, Greldick's ship literally flew through the passage, yawing and shuddering as she was seized by the violent riptides. Icy spray stung their faces, and Darian, half blinded by it, didn't see the enormous whirlpool at the center of the bore until they were almost upon it. He seemed to hear a vast roar and cleared his eyes just in time to see it yawning in front of him. "What's that?" he yelled over the noise. "The Great Maelstrom," Beric shouted. "Hold on!" The maelstrom was fully as large as the village of Upper Gralt, and descended horribly down into a seething, mist-filled pit unimaginably far below. Incredibly, instead of guiding his vessel away from the vortex, Greldick steered directly at it. "What's he doing?" Darian screamed. "It's a secret of passing through the bore," Beric roared. "We circle the maelstrom twice to gain more speed. If the ship doesn't break up, she comes out like a rock from a sling, and we pass through the riptides beyond the maelstrom before they can slow us down and drag us back." "If the ship doesn't what?" "Sometimes a ship is torn apart in the maelstrom," Beric said. "Don't worry, boy. It doesn't happen very often, and Greldick's ship seems stout enough." The ship's prow dipped hideously into the outer edges of the maelstrom, and then raced twice around the huge whirlpool, with the oarsmen frantically bending their backs to the frenzied beat of the drum. The wind tore at Darian's face, and he clung to his iron ring, keeping his eyes averted from the seething maw gaping below. And then they broke free and shot like a whistling stone through the churning water beyond the maelstrom. The wind of their passage howled in the rigging, and Darian felt half suffocated by its force. Gradually the ship slowed in the whirling eddies, but the speed they'd gained from the maelstrom carried them on to calm water in a partially sheltered cove on the Sandarian side. Beric was laughing gleefully and mopping spray from his beard. "Well, lad," he said, "what do you think of the bore?" Darian didn't trust himself to answer and concentrated on trying to pry his numb fingers from the iron ring. A familiar voice rang out from the stern. "Darian!" "Now you've gone and got me in trouble," Darian said resentfully, ignoring the fact that standing in the prow had been his own idea. Aunt Paul spoke scathingly to Beric about his irresponsibility, and then turned her attention to Garion. "Well," she said, "I'm waiting. Would you like to explain?" "It wasn't Beric's fault," Garion said. "It was my own idea." There was no point in their both being in trouble after all. "I see," she said. "And what was behind that?" The confusion and doubt which had been troubling him made him reckless. "I felt like it," he said half defiantly. For the first time in his life he felt on the verge of open rebellion. "You what?" "I felt like it," he repeated. "What difference does it make why I did it? You're going to punish me anyway." Aunt Paul stiffened and her eyes blazed. Mr. Wolf, who was sitting nearby, chuckled. "What's so funny?" she snapped. "Why don't you let me handle this, Paul?" the old man suggested. "I can deal with it," she said. "But not well," he said. "Not well at all. Your temper's too quick and your tongue's too sharp. He's not a child anymore. He's not a man yet, but he's not a child either. The problem needs to be dealt with in a special way. I'll take care of it." He stood up. "I think I insist, Paul." "You what?" "I insist." His eyes hardened. "Very well," she said in an icy voice, turned and walked away. "Sit down, Garion," the old man said. "Why's she so mean?" Garion blurted. "She isn't," Mr. Wolf said. "She's angry because you frightened her. Nobody likes to be frightened." "I'm sorry," Garion mumbled, ashamed of himself. "Don't apologize to me," Wolf said. "I wasn't frightened." He looked for a moment at Garion, his eyes penetrating. "What's the problem?" he asked. "They call you Belgarath," Garion said as if that explained it all, "and they call her Pulgaria." "So?" "It's just not possible." "Didn't we have this conversation before, a long time ago?" "Are you Belgarath?" Garion demanded bluntly. "Some people call me that. What difference does it make?" "I'm sorry," Garion said. "I just don't believe it." "All right," Wolf shrugged. "You don't have to if you don't want to. What's that got to do with your being impolite to your aunt?" "It's just," Garion faltered, "well..." Desperately he wanted to ask Mr. Wolf that ultimate fatal question, but despite his certainty that there was no kinship between himself and Aunt Paul, he couldn't bear the thought of having it finally and irrevocably confirmed. "You're confused," Wolf said. "Is that it? Nothing seems to be like it ought to be, and you're angry with your aunt because it seems like it has to be her fault." "You make it sound awfully childish," Garion said, flushing slightly. "Isn't it?" Garion flushed even more. "It's your own problem, Garion," Mr. Wolf said. "Do you really think it's proper to make others unhappy because of it?" "No," Garion admitted in a scarcely audible voice. "Your aunt and I are who we are," Wolf said quietly. "People have made up a lot of nonsense about us, but that doesn't really matter. There are things that have to be done, and we're the ones who have to do them. That's what matters. Don't make things more difficult for your aunt just because the world isn't exactly to your liking. It's not only childish, it's ill-mannered. And you're a better boy than that. Now, I really think you owe her an apology, don't you?" "I suppose so," Garion said. "I'm glad we had this chance to talk," the old man said. "But I wouldn't wait too long before making up with her. You wouldn't believe how long she can stay angry." He grinned suddenly. "She's been angry with me for as long as I can remember, and that's so long I don't even like to think about it." "I'll do it right now," Garion said. "Good," Wolf approved. Garion stood and walked purposefully to where Aunt Paul stood staring out at the swirling currents of the Shark Bore. "Aunt Paul," he said. "Yes, dear." "I'm sorry. I was wrong." She turned and looked at him gravely. "Yes," she said, "you were." "I won't do it again." She laughed then. A low, warm laugh, and ran her fingers through his tangled hair. "Don't make promises you can't keep, dear," she said, and she embraced him. And everything was all right again. After the fury of the tide through the Sherrick Bore had abated, they sailed north along the snow-muffled east coast of the Sherrick Peninsula toward the ancient city which was the ancestral home of all Alorans, Algar and Drasnia, as well as Sherrick and Riven. The wind was chill and the skies threatening, but the remainder of the voyage was uneventful. After 3 more days their ship entered the harbour at Valalorn and tied up at one of the ice-shrouded wharves. Valalorn was unlike any Sindarian city. Its walls and buildings were so incredibly ancient that they seemed more like natural rock formations than the construction of human hands. The narrow, crooked streets were clogged with snow, and the mountains behind the city loomed high and white against the dark sky. Several horse-drawn sleighs awaited them at the Several horse-drawn sleighs awaited them at the wharf with savage-looking drivers and shaggy horses stamping impatiently in the packed snow. There were fur robes in the sleighs, and Garion drew one of them about him as he waited for Beric to conclude his farewells to Greldic and the sailors. "Let's go," Beric told the driver as he climbed into the sleigh. "See if you can catch up with the others." "If you hadn't talked so long, they wouldn't be so far ahead, Lord Beric," the driver said sourly. "It's probably true," Beric agreed. The driver grunted, touched his horses with his whip, and the sleigh started up the street where the others had already disappeared. Fur-clad Sherrick warriors swaggered up and down the narrow streets, and many of them bellowed greetings to Beric as the sleigh passed. At one corner, the driver was forced to halt while two burly men, stripped to the waist in the biting cold, wrestled savagely in the snow at the center of the street, to the encouraging shouts of a crowd of onlookers. "A common pastime," Beric told Garion. "Winter's a tedious time in Val Loren." "Is that the palace ahead?" Garion asked. Beric shook his head. "The Temple of Balar," he said. "Some men say that the bear god resides there in spirit. I've never seen him myself, though, so I can't say for sure." Then the wrestlers rolled out of the way and they continued. On the steps of the temple, an ancient woman wrapped in ragged woolen robes stood with a long staff clutched in one bony hand and her stringy hair wild about her face. "Hail, Lord Beric!" she called in a cracked voice as they passed. "Thy doom still awaits thee." "Stop the sleigh," Beric growled at the driver, and he threw off his fur robe and jumped to the ground. "Marche!" he thundered at the old woman. "You've been forbidden to loiter here. If I tell Anheg that you've disobeyed him, he'll have the priests of the temple burn you for a witch." The old woman cackled at him, and Garion noted with a shudder that her eyes were a milk-white blankness. "The fire will not touch old Marche," she laughed shrilly. "That is not the doom which awaits her." "Enough of dooms," Beric said. "Get away from the temple." "Marche sees what she sees," the old woman said. "The mark of thy doom is still upon thee, great Lord Beric. When it comes to thee, thou shalt remember the words of old Marche." And then she seemed to look at the sleigh where Garion sat, though her milky eyes were obviously blind. Her expression suddenly changed from malicious glee to one strangely awestruck. "Hail, greatest of lords," she crooned, bowing deeply. "When thou comest into thine inheritance, remember that it was old Marche who first greeted thee." Beric started toward her with a roar, but she scurried away, her staff tapping on the stone steps. "What does she mean?" Garion asked when Beric returned to the sleigh. "She's a crazy woman," Beric replied, his face pale with anger. "She's always lurking around the temple, begging and frightening gullible housewives with her gibberish. If Anheg had any sense, he'd have had her driven out of the city or burned years ago." He climbed back into the sleigh. "Let's go," he growled at the driver. Garion looked back over his shoulder as they sped away, but the old blind woman was nowhere in sight. Welcome to the stream, those who just joined us. You're very welcome for the link. And this is kind of an ongoing thing. I'm definitely going to at least finish this first book. And if the response is good enough from folks, if folks seem to like it and want to hear more, I'll probably continue on and read the rest of the series. Probably not as quickly as I've been doing the first book. Like it's been less than a week since we started, and I'm probably like, I don't know, 3/4 of the way through the book, maybe a little bit more. So I'm really kind of burning through this first one quickly. I'm probably not going to be reading every day as we continue into the rest of the story. I might like take a week off in between doing the different books and focus on music stuff for a bit. But I've really been enjoying it, and as long as other folks are, I'll probably keep it up. Anyways, I'm not yet done for the day. We've only been going for about an hour, and I can usually handle about 2 before my voice gives out. So we're going to continue on with chapter 13 after I take a little drink. As reading is thirsty work. By the way, if you've missed any of the previous readings, I have been saving these and archiving them over on my YouTube channel. So I've actually got a playlist set up for this book, so you can start at the beginning and it'll just play all the way through up to where we are now. Usually I will upload these in the same day that I get done them. So If anyone has missed out on it and wants to catch up, if you know anyone who you think would like the rest of the series, if you think they'd like hearing the beginning of the book rather than jumping in the middle, there's already about 4 hours of reading up on the channel over there. So yeah, just pop over to the YouTube channel and the rest of it's there. Chapter 13. The palace of King Anheg of Sherrick was a vast, brooding structure near the centre of Alalorn. Huge wings, many of them crumbled into decay with unpaned windows staring emptily at the open sky through collapsed roofs, stretched out from the main building in all directions. So far as Garion could tell, there was no plan to the palace whatsoever. It had, it seemed, merely grown over the 3,000 years and more that the kings of Sherrick had ruled here. "Why is so much of it empty and broken down like that?" he asked Beric as their sleigh whirled into the snow-packed courtyard. "What some kings build, others let fall down," Beric said shortly. "It's a way of kings." Beric's mood had been black since their encounter with the blind woman at the temple. The others had all dismounted and stood waiting. "You've been away from home too long if you can get lost on your way on your way from the harbour to the palace," Silk said pleasantly. "We were delayed," Beric grunted. A broad iron-bound door at the top of the wide steps that led up to the palace opened then, as if someone behind it had been waiting for them all to arrive. A woman with long flaxen braids and wearing a deep scarlet cloak trimmed with bright rich fur stepped out onto the portico at the top of the stairs and stood looking down at them. "Greetings, Lord Beric, Earl of Trollheim and husband," she said formally. Beric's face grew even more sombre. "Merrill," he acknowledged her with a curt nod. King Anheg granted me permission to greet you, my lord," Beric's wife said, "as is my right and my duty." "You've always been very attentive to your duties, Merrill," Beric said. "Where are my daughters?" "At Trellheim, my lord," she said. "I didn't think it would be a good idea for them to travel so far in the cold." There was a faintly malicious note to her voice. Beric sighed. "I see," he said. "Was I in error, my lord?" Merrill asked. "Let it pass," Beric said. "If you and your friends are ready, my lord," she said, "I'll escort you to the throne room." Beric went up the stairs briefly and rather formally embraced his wife, and the two of them went through the wide doorway. "Tragic," the Earl of Selene murmured, shaking his head as they all went up the stairs to the palace door. "Hardly that," Silk said. "After all, Beric got what he wanted, didn't he?" "You're a cruel man, Prince Keldar," the Earl said. "Not really," Silk said. "I'm a realist, that's all. Beric spent all those years yearning after Merrill, and now he's got her. I'm delighted to see such steadfastness rewarded, aren't you?" The Earl of Selene sighed. A party of mailed warriors joined them and escorted them through a maze of corridors, up the broad stairs and down narrow ones, deeper and deeper into the vast pile. "I've always admired Sherrick architecture," Silk said sardonically. "It's so unanticipated." Expanding the palace gives weak kings something to do," King Fulric observed. "It's not a bad idea, really. In Sendaria, bad kings usually devote their time to street paving projects, but all of Alalorn was paved thousands of years ago." Silk laughed. "It's always been a problem, your majesty," he said. "How do you keep bad kings out of mischief?" "Prince Keldar," King Fulric said, "I don't wish your uncle any misfortune, but I think it might be very interesting if the crown of Drasnia just happened to fall to you." "Please, your majesty," Silk said with feigned shock. "Don't even suggest that." "Also a wife," the Earl of Selene said dryly. "The prince definitely needs a wife." "That's even worse," Silk said with a shudder. The throne room of King Anheg. Some of these names and the way they are structured in the sentences always trip me up. Anheg is one of them. I always kind of slur his name for some reason. I'm not sure why. It's so hard for me to say. We'll try that again. The throne room of King Anheg was a vaulted chamber with a great fire pit in the center where whole logs blazed and crackled. Unlike the lushly draped hall of King Fulrock, the stone walls here were bare, and torches flared and smoked in iron rings sunk into the stone. The men who lounged near the fire were not the elegant courtiers of Fulrock's court, but rather were bearded Sherrick warriors gleaming in chainmail. At one end of the room sat 5 thrones, each surmounted by a banner. 4 of the thrones were occupied, and 3 regal-looking women stood talking nearby. "Fulrock, King of Sendaria, One of the warriors who had escorted them boomed, striking the butt of his spear hollowly on the rust-strewn floor. "Hail, Fulrock!" a large black-bearded man on one of the thrones called, rising to his feet. His long blue robes were wrinkled and spotted, and his hair was shaggy and unkempt. The gold crown he wore was dented in a place or two, and one of its points had been broken off. "Hail, Anheg!" the king of the centaurs replied, bowing slightly. "The throne awaits thee, my dear Fulrock," the shaggy bearded man said, indicating the banner of Sendaria behind the one vacant throne. "The kings of Eloria welcome the wisdom of the king of Sendaria at this council." Garion found the stilted, archaic form of address strangely impressive. "Which king is which, friend Silk?" Dernick whispered as they approached the thrones. "The fat one in the red robe with the reindeer on his banner is my uncle, Rodar of Drasnia. The lean-faced one in black under the horse banner is Kohag of Algaria. The big, grim-faced one in grey with no crown who sits beneath the sword banner is Brand, the Riven Warder." "Brand?" Garion interrupted, startled as he remembered the stories of the Battle of Volmimber. "All Riven Warders are named Brand," Silk explained. King Fulrock greeted each of the other kings in the formal language that seemed to be customary, and then he took his place beneath the green banner with its golden sheaf of wheat that was the emblem of Sendaria. "Hail, Belgarath, disciple of Aldur," Anheg said, "and hail Lady Polgara, honoured daughter of the immortal Belgarath." "There's little time for all this ceremony, Anheg," Mr. Wolf said tartly, throwing back his cloak and striding forward. "Why have the kings of Eloria summoned me?" "Permit us our little ceremonies, ancient one," Rodar, the grossly fat king of Drasnia, said slyly. "We so seldom get the chance to play king. We won't be much longer at it." Mr. Wolf shook his head in disgust. One of the three regal-looking women came forward then. She was a tall, raven-haired beauty in an elaborately cross-tied black velvet gown. She curtsied to King Fulrock and touched her cheek briefly to his. "Your Majesty," she said, "your presence honours our home." "Your Highness," Fulrock replied, inclining his head respectfully. "Queen Islena," Silk murmured to Dernick and Garion, Aneg's wife. The little man's nose twitched with suppressed mirth. "Watch her when she greets Polgara." The queen turned and curtsied deeply to Mr. Wolf. "Divine Belgarath," she said, her voice... "Divine Belgarath," she said, her rich voice throbbing with respect. Hardly divine, Islena," the old man said dryly. "Immortal son of Aldur," she swept on, ignoring the interruption. "Mightiest sorcerer in all the world, my poor house trembles in the awesome power you bring within its walls." "A pretty speech, Islena," Wolf said. "A little inaccurate, but pretty all the same." But the queen had already turned to Aunt Paul. "Glorious sister," she intoned. "Sister?" Garion was startled. "She's a mystic," Silk said softly. "She dabbles a bit in magic and thinks herself a sorceress. Watch." With an elaborate gesture, the queen produced a green jewel and presented it to Aunt Paul. "She added up her sleeve," Silk whispered gleefully. "A royal gift, Islena," Aunt Paul said in a strange voice. "A pity that I can only offer this in return." She handed the queen a single deep red rose. "Where did she get that?" Garion asked in amazement. Silk winked at him. The queen looked at the rose doubtfully and cupped it between her two hands. She examined it closely, and her eyes widened. The colour drained out of her face, and her hands began to tremble. The second queen had stepped forward. She was a tiny blonde with a beautiful smile. Without ceremony, she kissed King Fulrock and then Mr. Wolf, and embraced Aunt Paul warmly. Her affection seemed simple and unself-conscious. "Poren, Queen of Drasnia," Silk said, and his voice had an odd note to it. Garion glanced at him and saw the faintest hint of a bitter, self-mocking expression flicker across his face. In that single instant, as clearly as if he'd suddenly been illuminated by a bright light, Garion saw the reason for Silk's sometimes strange manner. An almost suffocating surge of sympathy welled up in his throat. The third queen, Sylar of Algaria, greeted King Fulrock, Mr. Wolf, and Aunt Paul with a few brief words in a quiet voice. "Is the Riven Warder unmarried?" Dernick asked, looking around for another queen. "He had a wife," Silk said shortly, his eyes still on Queen Poren. "But she died some years ago. She left him 4 sons. "Ah," Dernick said. Then Beric, grim-faced and obviously angry, entered the hall and strode to King Anheg's throne. "Welcome home, cousin," King Anheg said. "I thought perhaps you'd lost your way." "Family business, Anheg," Beric said. "I had to have a few words with my wife." "Ah, I see," Anheg said and let it drop. Have you met our friends? Beric asked. Not as yet, Lord Beric, King Rodar said. We were involved with the customary formalities. He chuckled, and his great paunch jiggled. I'm sure you all know the Earl of Selene, Beric said, and this is Durnick, smith and a brave man. The boy's name is Garion. He's in Lady Polgara's care, a good lad. Do you suppose we could get on with this? Mr. Wolf asked impatiently. Cohag, king of the Algars, spoke in a strangely soft voice. Art thou aware, Belgariad, of the misfortune which had befallen us? We turn to thee for counsel. Cohag, Wolf said testily, you sound like a bad Orandish epic. Is all this theing and thouing really necessary? Cohag looked embarrassed, and glanced at King Anheg. It's my fault, Belgariad, Anheg said ruefully. I set scribes to work to record our meetings. Cohag was speaking to history as well as to you. His crown had slipped a bit and perched precariously over one ear. History's very tolerant, Anheg, Wolf said. You don't have to try to impress her. She'll forget most of what we say anyway. He turned to the Riven Warder. Brand, he said, do you suppose you could explain all this with too much embellishment? I'm afraid it's my fault, Belgarath, the grey-robed warder said in a deep voice. The apostate was able to carry off his theft because of my laxity. The thing's supposed to protect itself, Brand, Wolf told him. I can't even touch it. I know the thief, and there's no way you could have kept him out of Riva. What concerns me is how he was able to lay hands on it without being destroyed by its power. Brand spread his hands helplessly. We woke one morning and it was gone. The priests were only able to divine the name of the thief. The spirit of the bear god wouldn't say any more. Since we knew who he was, we were careful not to speak his name or the name of the thing he took. Good, Wolf said. He has ways to pick words out of the air at great distances. I taught him how to do that myself. Brand nodded. We knew that, he said. It made phrasing our message to you difficult. When you didn't come to Riva and my messenger didn't return, I thought something had gone wrong. That's when we sent men out to find you. Mr. Wolf scratched at his beard. Oh, I guess it's my own fault that I'm here, then, he said. I borrowed your messenger. I had him get word to some people in Erendia. I suppose I should have known better. Silk cleared his throat. May I speak? He asked politely. Certainly, Prince Keldar, King Anheg said. Is it entirely prudent to continue these discussions in public? Silk asked. The Murgos have enough gold to buy ears in many places, and the arts of the Grolem can lift the thoughts out of the minds of the most loyal warriors. What isn't known can't be revealed, if you take my meaning. The warriors of Anheg aren't so easily bought, Silk, Beric said testily. And there aren't any Grolems in Sherrick. Are you so confident about the serving men and the kitchen wenches? Silk suggested. And I found Grolems in some very unexpected places. There's something to what my nephew says, King Rodar said, his face thoughtful. Drosnia has centuries of experience in the gathering of information, and Keldar is one of our best. If he thinks that our words might go further than we want them to, we might be wise to listen to him. Thank you, Uncle, Silk said, bowing. Could you penetrate this palace, Prince Keldar? King Anheg challenged. I already have, Your Majesty, Silk said modesty. 12 times or more. Anheg looked at Rodar with one raised eyebrow. Rodar coughed slightly. It was some time ago, Anheg. Nothing serious. I was just curious about something, that's all. All you had to do was ask, Anheg said in a slightly injured tone. I didn't want to bother you, Rodar said with a shrug. Besides, it's more fun to do it the other way. Friends, King Fulrek said, the issue before us is too important to chance compromising it. Wouldn't it be better to be overcautious rather than to take any risks? King Anheg frowned and then shrugged. Whatever you wish, he said. We'll continue in private then. Cousin, would you clear old King Eldrig's hall for us, and set guards in the hallways near it? I will, Anheg, Beric said. He took 12 warriors and left the hall. The kings rose from their thrones, all except Cohag, a lean warrior, very nearly as tall as Beric, and with the shaved head and flowing scalp lock of the Algars, stepped forward and helped him up. Garion looked inquiringly at Silk. An illness when he was a child, Silk explained softly. It left his legs so weak he can't stand unaided. Doesn't that make it kind of hard for him to be king? Garion asked. Algars spend more time sitting on horses than they do standing on their feet, Silk said. Once he's on a horse, Cohag's the equal of any man in Algaria. The warrior who's helping him is Hetar, his adopted son. You know him? I know everyone, Garion. Silk laughed softly. Hetar and I have met a few times. I like him, though I'd rather he didn't know that. Queen Porraine came over to where they stood. Aislinn is taking Salar and me to her private quarters, she said to Silk. Apparently women aren't supposed to be involved in matters of state here in Sherrick. Our Sherrick cousins have a few blind spots, Your Highness, Silk said. They're arch-conservatives, of course, and it hasn't occurred to them yet that women are human. Queen Porraine winked at him with a sly little grin. I'd hoped we might get a chance to talk, Keldar, but it doesn't look like it now. Did you get my message to Layla? Silk nodded. She said she'd write you immediately, he said. If we'd known you were going to be here, I could have carried her letter myself. It was Isleena's idea, she said. She decided it might be nice to have a council of queens while the kings were meeting. She'd have invited Layla too, but everyone knows how terrified she is of sea travel. Has your council produced anything momentous, Highness? Silk asked lightly. Queen Porraine made a face. We sit around and watch Isleena do tricks. Disappearing coins, things up her sleeves, that kind of thing, she said. Or she tells fortunes. Salar's too polite to object, and I'm the youngest, so I'm not supposed to say too much. It's terribly dull, particularly when she goes into trances over that stupid crystal ball of hers. Did Layla think she could help me? If anyone can, Silk assured her. I should warn you, though, that her advice is likely to be quite explicit. Queen Layla's an earthy little soul and sometimes very blunt. Queen Porraine giggled wickedly. That's all right, she said. I'm a grown woman after all. Of course, Silk said. I just wanted to prepare you, that's all. Are you making fun of me, Keldar? She asked. Would I do that, Your Highness? Silk asked, his face full of innocence. I think you would, she said. Coming, Porraine? Queen Isleena asked from not far away. At once, Your Highness, the Queen of Drasnia said. Her fingers flickered briefly at Silk. What a bore. Patience, Highness, Silk gestured in reply. Queen Porraine docilely followed the stately Queen of Sherrick and the silent Queen of Belgariad from the hall. Silk's eyes followed her, and his face had that same self-mocking expression as before. The others are leaving, Garion said delicately, and pointed to the far end of the hall where the Aloran kings were just going out the door. All right, Silk said and led the way quickly after them. Garion stayed at the rear of the group as they all made their way through the drafty corridors toward King Eldric's hall. The dry voice in his mind told him that if Aunt Paul saw him, she'd probably find a reason to send him away. As he loitered along the rear of the procession, a furtive movement flickered briefly down one of the side corridors. He caught only a glimpse of the man, an ordinary-looking Sherrick warrior wearing a dark green cloak, and then they'd moved past the corridor. Garion stopped and stepped back to look again, but the man in the green cloak was gone. At the door to King Eldric's hall, Aunt Paul stood waiting with her arms crossed. Where have you been? She asked. I was just looking, he said as innocently as possible. I see, she said then. Then she turned to Beric. The council's probably going to last a long time, she said, and Garion's just going to get restless before it's over. Is there some place he can amuse himself until supper time? Aunt Paul, Garion protested. The armory, perhaps? Beric suggested. What would I do in an armory? Garion demanded. Would you prefer the scullery? Aunt Paul asked pointedly. On second thought, I think I might like to see the armory. I thought you might. It's at the far end of this corridor, Garion, Beric said. The room with the red door. Run along, dear, Aunt Paul said, and try not to cut yourself on anything. Garion sulked slowly down the corridor Beric had pointed out to him, keenly feeling the injustices of the situation. The guards posted in the passageway outside of King Eldric's hall even made eavesdropping impossible. Garion sighed and continued his solitary way toward the armory. The other part of his mind was busy, however, mulling over certain problems. Despite his stubborn refusal to accept the possibility that Mr. Wolf and Aunt Paul were indeed Belgarath and Polgara, the behavior of the Aloran kings made it obvious that at least they did believe it. Then there was the question of the rose Aunt Paul had given to Queen Isleena. Setting aside the fact that roses don't bloom in the winter, how had Aunt Paul known that Isleena would present her with that green jewel, and therefore prepared the rose in advance? He deliberately avoided the idea that his aunt had simply created the rose on the spot. The corridor along which he passed, deep in thought, was dim, with only a few torches set in rings in the walls to light the way. Side passages branched out from it here and there, gloomy, unlighted openings that stretched back into the darkness. He had almost reached the armory when he heard a faint sound in one of those dark passages. Without exactly knowing why, he drew back into one of the other openings and waited. The man in the green cloak stepped out into the lighted corridor and looked around furtively. He was an ordinary-looking man with a short, sandy beard, and he probably could have walked anywhere in the palace without attracting much notice. His manner, however, and his stealthy movements cried out louder than words that what he was doing was something he wasn't supposed to. He hurried up the corridor in the direction from which Garion had come, and Garion shrank back into the protective darkness of his hiding place. When he carefully poked his head out into the corridor again, the man had disappeared, and it was impossible to know down which of those dark side passages he'd gone. Garion's inner voice told him that even if he told anyone about this, they wouldn't listen. He'd need more than just an uneasy feeling of suspicion to report if he didn't want to appear foolish. All he could do for the time being was to keep his eyes open for the man in the green cloak. So this is one of the little things that I like about this series, is that sometimes there are important things that are happening, and Garion's just like too young and unimportant to really be part of them, so they send him off somewhere else. And there are still interesting things that happen during those times, but I like that there are parts of the story that kind of go on without us knowing about what's going on. We see everything from Garion's point of view, as opposed to it, switching to whoever might be the most relevant in the overall larger story. So it's one of those little details. This was the first book that I'd really read that had that kind of thing happen. All right. Chapter 14. It was snowing the following morning, and Aunt Paul, Silk, Beric, and Mr. Wolf again met for council with the kings, leaving Garion in Dernick's keeping. The two sat near the fire in the huge hall with the thrones, watching the 24 or so bearded Sherrick warriors who lounged about, or engaged in various activities to pass the time. Some of them sharpened their swords or polished their armor. Others ate or sat drinking, even though it was still quite early in the morning. Several were engaged in a heated dice game, and some simply sat with their backs against the wall and slept. "These Sherricks seem to be very idle people," Dernick said quietly to Garion. "I haven't seen anyone actually working since we've arrived, have you?" Garion shook his head. "I think these are the king's own warriors," he said just as quietly. "I don't think they're supposed to do anything except sit around and wait for the king to tell them to go fight someone." Dernick frowned disapprovingly. "It must be a terribly boring way to live," he said. "Dernick," Garion asked after a moment, "did you notice the way Beric and his wife acted towards each other?" "It's very sad," Dernick said. "Silk told me about it yesterday. Beric fell in love with her when they were both very young, but she was highborn and didn't take him very seriously." "How does it happen that they're married then?" Garion asked. "It was her family's idea," Dernick explained. "After Beric became Earl of Trellheim, they decided that a marriage would give them a valuable connection. Meryl objected, but it didn't do her any good. Silk said that Beric found out after they were married that she's really a very shallow person, but of course it was too late by then. She does spiteful things to try to hurt him, and he spends as much time away from home as possible." "Did they have any children?" Garion asked. "Two," Dernick said. "Both girls, about 5 and 7. Beric loves them very much, but he doesn't get to see them very often." Garion sighed. "I wish there was something we could do," he said. "We can't interfere between a man and his wife," Dernick said. "Things like that just aren't done." "Do you know that Silk's in love with his aunt?" Garion said without stopping to think. "Garion!" Dernick's voice was shocked. "That's an unseemly thing to say." "It's true all the same," Garion said defensively. "Of course she's not really his aunt, I guess. She's his uncle's second wife. It's not exactly like she was his real aunt." "She's married to his uncle," Dernick said firmly. "Who made up this scandalous story?" "Nobody made it up," Garion said. "I was watching his face when he talked to her yesterday. It's pretty plain the way he feels about her." "I'm sure you just imagined it," Dernick said disapprovingly. He stood up. "Let's look around. That'll give us something better to do than sit here gossiping about our friends. It's really not the sort of thing decent men do." "All right," Garion said quickly, a little embarrassed. He stood up and followed Dernick across the smoky hall and out into the corridor. "Let's have a look at the kitchen," Garion suggested. "And the smithy, too," Dernick said. The royal kitchens were enormous. Entire oxen roasted on spits, and whole flocks of geese simmered in lakes of gravy. Stews bubbled in cart-sized cauldrons, and battalions of loaves were marched into ovens big enough to stand in. Unlike Aunt Paul's well-ordered kitchen at Faldar's farm, everything here was chaos and confusion. The head cook was a huge man with a red face who screamed orders whichever one ignored. There were shouts and threats, and a great deal of horseplay. A spoon heated in a fire and left where an unsuspecting cook would pick it up brought shrieks of mirth, and one man's hat was stolen and deliberately thrown into a seething pot of stew. "Let's go someplace else, Dernick," he said. "This isn't what I expected at all." Dernick nodded. Mistress Paul would never tolerate all this foolishness. He agreed disapprovingly. In the hallway outside the kitchen, a maid with reddish blonde hair and a pale green dress cut quite low at the bodice loitered. "Excuse me," Dernick said to her politely. "Could you direct us to the smithy?" She looked him up and down boldly. "Are you new here?" she asked. "I haven't seen you before." "We're just visiting," Dernick said. "Where are you from?" she demanded. "Sandaria," Dernick said. "How interesting. Perhaps the boy could run this errand for you, and you and I could talk for a while." Her look was direct. Dernick coughed and his ears reddened. The smithy?" he asked again. The maid laughed lightly. "In the courtyard at the end of the corridor," she said. "I'm usually around here someplace. I'm sure you can find me when you finish this business with the smith." "Yes," Dernick said. "I'm sure I could. Come along, Garion." They went on down the corridor and out into a snowy inner courtyard. "Outrageous," Dernick said stiffly, his ears still flaming. "The girl has no sense of propriety whatsoever. I'd report her if I knew to whom." "Shocking," Garion agreed, secretly amused by Dernick's embarrassment. They crossed the courtyard through the slightly sifting snow. The smithy was presided over by a huge black-bearded man with forearms as thick as Garion's thighs. Dernick introduced himself, and the two were soon happily talking shop, to the accompaniment of the ringing blows of the smith's hammer. Garion noticed that instead of the plows, spades, and hoes that would fill a Sandarian smithy, the walls here were hung with swords, spears, and war-axes. At one forge an apprentice was hammering out arrowheads, and at another a lean, one-eyed man was working on an evil-looking dagger. Dernick and the smith talked together for most of the remainder of the morning, while Garion wandered about the inner courtyard watching the various workmen at their tasks. There were coopers and wheelwrights, cobblers and carpenters, saddlers and candlemakers, all busily at work to maintain the huge household of King Enheg. As he watched, Garion also kept his eyes open for the sandy-bearded man in the green cloak he'd seen the night before. It wasn't likely that the man would be here where honest work was being done, but Garion stayed alert all the same. About noon, Barrett came looking for them and led them back to the great hall where Silk lounged, intently watching a dice game. "Enheg and the others went to meet privately this afternoon," Barrett said. "I've got an errand to run, and I thought you might want to go along." "That might not be a bad idea," Silk said, tearing his eyes from the game. "Your cousin's warriors dice badly, and I'm tempted to try a few rolls with them. It'd probably be better if I didn't. Most men take offense at losing to strangers." Barrett grinned. "I'm sure they'd be glad to let you play, Silk," he said. "They've got just as much chance of winning as you do." Just as the sun has as much chance of coming up in the west as in the east," Silk said. "Are you that sure of your skill, friend Silk?" Dernick asked. "I'm sure of theirs," Silk chuckled. He jumped up. "Let's go," he said. "My fingers are starting to itch. Let's get them away from temptation." "Anything you say, Prince Keldar," Barrack laughed. They all put on fur cloaks and left the palace. The snow had almost stopped, and the wind was brisk. "I'm a bit confused by all these names," Dernick said as they trudged toward the central part of Alalorn. "I've been meaning to ask about it. You, Silk, are also Prince Keldar, and sometimes the merchant Ambar of Kotu, and Mr. Wolf is called Belgariad, and Mistress Paul is also Lady Polgara or the Duchess of Arat. Where I come from, people usually have only one name." "Names are like clothes, Dernick," Silk explained. "We put on what's most suitable for the occasion. Honest men have little need to wear strange clothes or strange names. Those of us who aren't so honest, however, occasionally have the need to change one or the other." "I don't find it amusing to hear Mistress Paul described as not being honest," Dernick said stiffly. "No disrespect intended," Silk assured him. "Simple definitions don't apply to Lady Polgara, and when I say that we're not honest, I simply mean that this business we're in sometimes requires us to conceal ourselves from people who are evil as well as devious." Dernick looked unconvinced, but let it pass. "Let's take this street," Barrack suggested. "I don't want to pass the Temple of Balar today." "Why?" Garion asked. "I'm a little behind in my religious duties," Barrack said with a pained look, "and I'd rather not be reminded of it by the High Priest of Balar. His voice is very penetrating, and I don't like being called down in front of the whole of the city. A prudent man doesn't give either a priest or woman the opportunity to scold him in public." The streets of Alalorn were narrow and crooked, and the ancient stone houses were tall and narrow with overhanging second stories. Despite the intermittent snow and the crisp wind, the streets seemed full of people, most of them garbed in fur against the chill. There was much good-natured shouting and the exchange of body insults. Two elderly and dignified men were pelting each other with snowballs in the middle of one street, to the raucous encouragement of the bystanders. "They're old friends," Beric said with a broad grin. "They do this every day all winter long. Pretty soon they'll go to an alehouse and get drunk, and sing old songs together until they fall off their benches. They've been doing it for years now." "What do they do in the summer?" Silk asked. "They throw rocks," Beric said. "The drinking and singing and falling off the benches stays the same, though." "Hello, Beric," a green-eyed young woman called from an upper window. "When are you coming to see me again?" Beric glanced up and his face flushed, but he didn't answer. "That lady's talking to you, Beric," Garion said. "I heard her," Beric replied shortly. "She seems to know you," Silk said with a sly look. "She knows everyone," Beric said, flushing even more. "Can we move along?" Around another corner, a group of men dressed in shaggy furs shuffled along in single file. Their gait was a curious swaying from side to side, and people quickly made way for them. "Hail, Lord Beric," their leader intoned. "Hail, Lord Beric," the others said in unison, still swaying. Beric bowed stiffly. "May the arm of Balar protect thee," the leader said. "All praise to Balar, bear god of Eloria," the others said. Beric bowed again and stood until the procession had passed. "Who were they?" Durnik asked. "Bear cultists," Beric said with distaste. "Religious fanatics." "A troublesome group," Silk explained. "They have chapters in all the Aloran kingdoms. They're excellent warriors, but they're the instruments of the High Priest of Balar. They spend their time in rituals, military training, and interfering in local politics." "Where's this Eloria they spoke of?" Garion asked. "All around us," Beric said with a broad gesture. "Eloria used to be all the Aloran kingdoms together. They were all one nation. The cultists want to reunite them." "That doesn't seem unreasonable," Durnik said. "Eloria was divided for a reason," Beric said. "A certain thing had to be protected, and the division of Eloria was the best way to do that." "Was this thing so important?" Durnik asked. "It's the most important thing in the world," Silk said. "The bear cultists tend to forget that." "Only now it's been stolen, hasn't it?" Garion blurted as that dry voice in his mind informed him of the connection between what Beric and Silk had just said and the sudden disruption of his own life. "It's this thing that Mr. Wolf is following." Beric glanced quickly at him. "The lad's wiser than we thought, Silk," he said soberly. "He's a clever boy," Silk agreed, "and it's not hard to put it all together." His weasel face was grave. "You're right, of course, Garion," he said. "We don't know how yet, but someone's managed to steal it. If Belgariad gives the word, the Aloran kings will take the world apart stone by stone to get it back." "You mean war?" Durnik said in a sinking voice. "There are worse things than war," Beric said grimly. "It might be a good opportunity to dispose of the Angarax once and for all." "Let's hope that Belgariad can persuade the Aloran kings otherwise," Silk said. "The thing has to be recovered," Beric insisted. "Granted," Silk agreed, "but there are other ways, and I hardly think a public street's the place to discuss our alternatives." Beric looked around quickly, his eyes narrowing. They had by then reached the harbour where the masts of the ships of Sherrock rose as thickly as trees in a forest. They crossed an icy bridge over a frozen stream and came to several large yards where the skeletons of ships lay in the snow. A limping man in a leather smock came from a low stone building in the centre of one of the yards and stood watching them approach. "Ho, Krendig," Beric called. "Ho, Beric," the man in the leather smock replied. "How's the work go?" Beric asked. "Slowly in this season," Krendig said. "It's not a good time to work with wood. My artisans are fashioning the fittings and sawing the boards, but we won't be able to do much more till spring." Beric nodded and walked over to lay his hand on the new wood of the ship prow rising out of the snow. "Krendig's building this for me," he said, patting the prow. "She'll be the finest ship afloat." "If your oarsmen are strong enough to move her," Krendig said, "she'll be very big, Beric, and very heavy." "Then I'll man her with big men," Beric said, still gazing at the ribs of the ship. Garion heard a gleeful shout from the hillside above the shipyard and looked up quickly. Several young people were sliding down the hill on smooth planks. It was obvious that Beric and the others were going to spend most of the rest of the afternoon discussing the ship. While that might be all very interesting, Garion realized that he hadn't spoken with anyone his own age for a long time. He drifted away from the others and stood at the foot of the hill, watching. One blonde girl particularly attracted his eye. In some ways she reminded him of Zubret, but there were some differences. Where Zubret had been petite, this girl was as big as a boy, though she was noticeably not a boy. Her laughter rang out merrily, and her cheeks were pink in the cold afternoon air as she slid down the hill with her long braids flying behind her. "That looks like fun," Garion said as her improvised sled came to a rest nearby. "Would you like to try?" she asked, getting up and brushing the snow from her woolen dress. "I don't have a sled," he told her. "I might let you use mine," she said, looking at him archly, "if you gave me something." "What would you want me to give you?" he asked. "We'll think of something," she said, eyeing him boldly. "What's your name?" "Garion," he said. "What an odd name. Do you come from here?" "No, I'm from Sendaria." "A Sendar, truly?" Her blue eyes twinkled. "I've never met a Sendar before. My name's Mady." Garion inclined his head slightly. "Do you want to use my sled?" Mady asked. "I might like to try it," Garion said. "I might let you," she said, "for a kiss." Garion blushed furiously, and Mady laughed. A large red-haired boy in a long tunic slid to a stop nearby and rose with a menacing look on his face. "Mady, come away from there," he ordered. "What if I don't want to?" she asked. The red-haired boy swaggered over to Garion. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "I was talking to Mady," Garion said. "Who gave you permission?" the red-haired boy asked. He was a bit taller than Garion and somewhat heavier. "I didn't bother to ask permission," Garion said. The red-haired boy glowered, flexing his muscles threateningly. "I can thrash you if I like," he announced. Garion realized that the redhead was feeling belligerent and that a fight was inevitable. The preliminaries, threats, insults, and the like would probably go on for several more minutes, but the fight would take place as soon as the boy in the long tunic had worked himself up to it. Garion decided not to wait. He doubled his fist and punched the larger boy in the nose. The blow was a good one, and the redhead stumbled back and sat down heavily in the snow. He raised one hand to his nose and brought it away bright red. "It's bleeding!" he wailed accusingly. "You made my nose bleed!" "It'll stop in a few minutes," Garion said. "What if it doesn't?" "Nosebleeds don't last forever," Garion told him. "Why did you hit me?" the redhead demanded tearfully, wiping his nose. "I didn't do anything to you." "You were going to," Garion said. "Put snow on it and don't be such a baby." "It's still bleeding," the boy said. "Put snow on it," Garion said again. "What if it doesn't stop bleeding?" "Then you'll probably bleed to death," Garion said in a heartless tone. It was a trick he learned from Aunt Paul. It worked as well on the sheriff boy as it had on Darun and Runderig. The redhead blinked at him and took a large handful of snow and held it to his nose. "Are all Sendars so cruel?" Mady said. "I don't know all people in Sendaria," Garion said. The affair hadn't turned out well at all, and regretfully he turned and started back toward the shipyard. "Garion, wait," Mady said. She ran after him and caught him by the arm. "You forgot my kiss," she said, threw her arms around his neck and kissed him soundly on the lips. "There," she said, and she turned and ran laughing back up the hill, her blonde braids flying behind her. Barrack, Silk, and Dernick were all laughing when he returned to where they stood. "You were supposed to chase her," Barrack said. "What for?" Garion asked, flushing at their laughter. "She wanted you to catch her." "I don't understand." "Barrack," Silk said, "I think that one of us is going to have to inform the Lady Polgara that our Garion needs some further education." "You're skilled with words, Silk," Barrack said. "I'm sure you ought to be the one to tell her." "Why don't we throw dice for the privilege?" Silk suggested. "I've seen you throw dice before, Silk," Barrack laughed. "Of course we could simply stay here a while longer," Silk said slyly. "I rather imagine that Garion's new playmate would be quite happy to complete his education, and that way we wouldn't have to bother Lady Polgara about it." Garion's ears were flaming. "I'm not as stupid as all that," he said hotly. "I know what you're talking about, and you don't have to say anything to Aunt Paul about it." He stamped away angrily, kicking at the snow. After Barrack had talked for a while longer with his shipbuilder, and the harbour had begun to darken with the approach of evening, they started back toward the palace. Garion sulked along behind, still offended by their laughter. The clouds which had hung overhead since their arrival in Valalorn had begun to tatter, and patches of clear sky began to appear. Here and there single stars twinkled as evening slowly settled in on the snowy streets. The soft light of candles began to glow in the windows of the houses, and the few people left in the streets hurried to get home before dark. Garion, still loitering behind, saw two men entering a wide door beneath a crude sign depicting a cluster of grapes. One of them was a sandy-bearded man in the green cloak that he'd seen in the palace the night before. The other man wore a dark hood, and Garion felt a familiar tingle of recognition. Even though he couldn't see the hooded man's face, there was no need of that. They had looked at each other too often for there to be any doubts. As always before, Garion felt that peculiar restraint, almost like a ghostly finger touching his lips. The hooded man was Asherak, and though the Murgo's presence here was very important, it was for some reason impossible for Garyon to speak of it. He watched the two men only for a moment, and then hurried to catch up with his friends. He struggled with the compulsion that froze his tongue and then tried another approach. "Beric," he asked, "are there many Murgos in Valalorn?" "There aren't any Murgos in Sherrick," Beric said. "Angaraks aren't allowed in the kingdom on pain of death. It's our oldest law. It was laid down by old Sherrick Bareshoulders himself." "Why do you ask?" "I was just wondering," Garyon said lamely. His mind shrieked with the need to tell them about Asherak, but his lips stayed frozen. That evening, when they were all seated at the long table in King Anheg's central hall, with a great feast set before them, Beric entertained them with a broadly exaggerated account of Garyon's encounter with the young people on the hillside. "A great blow it was," he said in expansive tones, "worthy of the mightiest warrior, and truly struck upon the nose of the foe. The bright blood flew, and the enemy was dismayed and overcome. Like a hero, Garyon stood over the vanquished, and, like a true hero, did not boast nor taunt his fallen opponent, but offered instead advice for quelling that crimson flood. With simple dignity, then, he quit the field, but the bright-eyed maid would not let him depart unrewarded for his valor. Hastily she pursued him and fondly clasped her snowy arms about his neck, and there she lovingly bestowed that single kiss that is the true hero's greatest reward. Her eyes flamed with admiration, and her chaste bosom heaved with newly wakened passion, but modest Garyon innocently departed, and tarried not to claim those other sweet rewards the gentle maid's fond demeanour so clearly offered. And thus the adventure ended with our hero tasting victory, but tenderly declining victory's true compensation." The warriors and kings at the long table roared with laughter, and pounded the table on their knees into each other's backs in their glee. Queen Eslina and Queen Solar smiled tolerantly, and Queen Poren laughed openly. Lady Morel, however, remained stony-faced, her expression faintly contemptuous as she looked at her husband. Garyon sat with his face aflame, his ears besieged with shouted suggestions and advice. "Is that really the way it happened, nephew?" King Rodar demanded of Silk, wiping tears from his eyes. "More or less," Silk replied. "Lord Beric's telling was masterly, though a good deal embellished." "We should send for a minstrel," the Earl of Selene said. "This exploit should be immortalized in song." "Don't tease him," Queen Poren said, looking sympathetically at Garyon. Aunt Paul didn't seem amused. Her eyes were cold as she looked at Beric. "Isn't it odd that 3 grown men can't keep one boy out of trouble?" she said with a raised eyebrow. "It was only one blow, my lady," Silk protested, "and only one kiss, after all." "Really," she said, "and what's it going to be next time? A duel with swords, perhaps, and even greater foolishness afterwards." "There was no real harm in it, Mistress Paul," Dernick assured her. Anne Paul shook her head. "I thought you at least had good sense, Dernick," she said, "but now I see that I was wrong." Garyon suddenly resented her remarks. It seemed that no matter what he did, she was ready to take it in the worst possible light. His resentment flared at the verge of open rebellion. What right had she to say anything about what he did? There was no tie between them, after all, and he could do anything he wanted without her permission if he felt like it. He glared at her in sullen anger. She caught the look and returned it with a cool expression that seemed almost to challenge him. "Well?" she asked. "Nothing," he said shortly. Get comfortable here. Sitting in one position for too long. Legs start to go to sleep. Chapter 15. The next morning dawned bright and crisp. The sky was a deep blue, and the sunlight was dazzling on the white mountain tops that rose behind the city. After breakfast, Mr. Wolf announced that he and Aunt Paul would again meet privately that day with Fulrock and the Alaran Kings. "Good idea," Beric said. "Gloomy ponderings are good for kings. Unless one has regal obligations, however, it's much too fine a day to be wasted indoors." He grinned mockingly at his cousin. "There's a streak of cruelty in you I hadn't suspected, Beric," King Anheg said, glancing longingly out of a nearby window. "Do the wild boars still come to the edges of the forest?" Beric asked. "In droves," Anheg replied even more disconsolately. "Thought I might gather a few good men and go out and see if we can thin their numbers a bit," Beric said, his grin even wider now. "I was almost sure you had something like that in mind," Anheg said moodily, scratching at his unkempt hair. "I'm doing you a service, Anheg," Beric said. "You don't want your kingdom overrun with a beast, do you?" Rodar, the fat king of Drasnia, laughed hugely. "I think he's got you, Anheg," he said. "He usually does," Anheg agreed sourly. "I gladly leave such activities to younger and leaner men. Rodar said. He slapped his vast paunch with both hands. I don't mind a good supper, but I'd rather not have to fight with it first. I make too good a target. The blindest boar in the world wouldn't have much trouble finding me. Well, Silk, Beric said, what do you say? You're not serious, Silk said. You must go along, Prince Keldar, Queen Poraine insisted. Someone has to represent the honor of Drasni in this venture. Silk's face looked pained. You can be my champion, she said, her eyes sparkling. Have you been reading Orandish epics again, Your Highness? Silk asked acidly. Consider it a royal command, she said. Some fresh air and exercise won't hurt you. You're starting to look dyspeptic. Silk bowed ironically. As you wish, Your Highness, he said. I suppose that if things get out of hand, I can always climb a tree. How about you, Dernick? Beric asked. I don't know much about hunting, Beric, Dernick said doubtfully, but I'll come along if you like. My lord? Beric asked the Earl of Selene politely. Oh no, Lord Beric, Selene laughed. I outgrew my enthusiasm for such sport years ago. Thanks for the invitation, however. Hetar? Beric asked the rangy Algar. Hetar glanced quickly at his father. Go along, Hetar, Cohag said in his soft voice. I'm sure King Enheg will lend me a warrior to help me walk. I'll do it myself, Cohag, Enheg said. I've carried heavier burdens. I'll go with you then, Lord Beric, Hetar said, and thanks for asking me. His voice was deep and resonant, but very soft, much like that of his father. Well, lad, Beric asked Garion. Have you lost your wits entirely, Beric? Aunt Paul snapped. Didn't you get him into enough trouble yesterday? That was the last straw. The sudden elation he felt at Beric's invitation turned to anger. Garion gritted his teeth and threw away all caution. If Beric doesn't think I'll just be in the way, I'll be glad to go along, he announced defiantly. Aunt Paul stared at him, her eyes suddenly very hard. Your cub's growing teeth, Paul, Mr. Wolf chuckled. Be still, father, Aunt Paul said, still glaring at Garion. Not this time, miss, the old man said with a hint of iron in his voice. He made his decision, and you're not going to humiliate him by unmaking it for him. Garion isn't a child now. You may not have noticed, but he's almost man-high and filling out now. He'll soon be 15, Paul. You're going to have to relax your grip sometime, and now's as good a time as any to start treating him like a man. She looked at him for a moment. Whatever you say, father, she said at last with deceptive meekness. I'm sure we'll want to discuss this later, though, in private. Mr. Wolf winced. Aunt Paul looked at Garion then. Try to be careful, dear, she said. And when you come back, we'll have a nice long talk, won't we? Will my lord require my aid in arming himself for the hunt? Lady Merrill asked in the stilted and insulting manner she always assumed with Beric. That won't be necessary, Merrill, Beric said. I would not neglect any of my duties, she said. Leave it alone, Merrill, Beric said. You've made your point. Have I my lord's permission, then, to withdraw? She asked. You have, he said shortly. Perhaps you ladies would like to join me, Queen Eslina said. We'll cast auguries and see if we can't predict the outcome of the hunt. Queen Poraine, who stood somewhat behind the Queen of Sherrick, rolled her eyes upward in resignation. Queen Salar smiled at her. Let's go then, Beric said. The boars are waiting. Sharpening their tusks, no doubt, Silk said. Beric led them down to the red door of the armory, where they were joined by a grizzled man with enormously broad shoulders, who wore a bull-hide shirt with metal plates sewn on it. This is Torvik, Beric introduced the grizzled man, Enheg's chief huntsman. He knows every boar in the forest by first name. My lord Beric is overkind, Torvik said, bowing. How does one go about this hunting of boars, friend Torvik? Dernick asked politely. I've never done it before. It's a simple thing, Torvik explained. I take my huntsmen into the forest and we drive the beasts with noise and shouting. You and the other hunters wait for them with ease. He gestured at a rack of stout, broad-headed boar spears. When the boar sees you standing in his way, he charges you and he tries to kill you with his tusks, but instead you kill him with your spear. I see, Dernick said somewhat doubtfully. Doesn't sound very complicated. We wear mail shirts, Dernick, Beric said. Our hunters are hardly ever injured seriously. Hardly ever has an uncomfortable ring of frequency to it, Beric, Silk said, fingering a mail shirt hanging on a peg near the door. No sport is very entertaining without a certain element of risk, Beric shrugged, lifting a boar spear. Have you ever thought of throwing dice instead? Silk asked. Not with your dice, my friend, Beric laughed. They began pulling on mail shirts while Torvik's huntsmen carried several armloads of boar spears out to the sleighs waiting in the snowy courtyard of the palace. Garion found the mail shirt heavy and more than a little uncomfortable. The steel rings dug at his skin even through his heavy clothes, and every time he tried to shift his posture to relieve the pressure of one of them, a half-dozen others bit at him. The air was very cold as they climbed into the sleighs, and the usual fur robes seemed hardly adequate. They drove through the narrow twisting streets of Valalorn toward the great west gate on the opposite side of the city from the harbour. The breath of the horses steamed in the icy air as they rode. The ragged old blind woman from the temple stepped from a doorway as they passed in the bright morning sun. "Hail, Lord Beric," she croaked. "Thy doom is at hand. Thou shalt taste of it before the day's sun finds its bed." Without a word, Beric rose in his sleigh, took up a boar spear, and cast it with deadly accuracy full at the old woman. With surprising speed, the witch woman swung her staff and knocked the spear aside in midair. It will avail thee not to try to kill old Marchi," she laughed scornfully. "Thy spear shall not find her, neither shall thy sword. Go thou, Beric, thy doom awaits thee." And then she turned toward the sleigh in which Geryon sat beside the startled Durnick. "Hail, Lord of Lords," she intoned. "Thy peril this day shall be great, but thou shalt survive it. And it is thy peril which shall reveal the mark of the beast, which is the doom of thy friend Beric." And then she bowed and scampered away before Beric could lay his hands on another spear. "What was all that about, Geryon?" Durnick asked, his eyes still surprised. "Beric says she's a crazy old blind woman," Geryon said. "She stopped us when we arrived in Valalorn after you and the others had already passed." "What was all that talk about doom?" Durnick asked with a shudder. "I don't know," Geryon said. "Beric wouldn't explain it." "It's a bad omen so early in the day," Durnick said. "These Sherricks are strange people." Geryon nodded in agreement. Beyond the west gate of the city, there were open fields, sparkling white in the full glare of the morning sun. They crossed the fields towards the dark edge of the forest 2 leagues away, with great plumes of powdery snow flying out behind their racing sleighs. Farmsteads lay muffled in snow along their track. The buildings were all made of logs and had high-peaked wooden roofs. "These people seem to be indifferent to danger," Durnick said. "I certainly wouldn't want to live in a wooden house, what with the possibility of fire and all." "It's a different country, after all," Geryon said. "We can't expect the whole world to live the way we do in Cinderia." "I suppose not," Durnick sighed. "But I'll tell you, Geryon, I'm not very comfortable here. Some people just aren't meant for travel. Sometimes I wish we'd never left Valdor's farm." "I do too sometimes," Geryon admitted, looking at the towering mountains that seemed to rise directly out of the forest ahead. "Someday it'll be over, though, and we'll be able to go home again." Durnick nodded and sighed once more. By the time they entered the woods, Beric had regained his temper and his good spirits, and he set about placing the hunters as if nothing had happened. He led Geryon through the calf-deep snow to a large tree some distance from the narrow sleigh track. "This is a good place," he said. "There's a game trail here, and the boars may use it to try to escape the noise of Torvik and his huntsmen. When one comes, brace yourself and hold your spear with its point aimed at its chest. They don't see very well, and he'll run full into your spear before he even knows it's there. After that, it's probably best to jump behind a tree. Sometimes the spear makes them very angry." "What if I miss?" Geryon asked. "I wouldn't do that," Beric advised. "It's not a very good idea." "I didn't mean I was going to do it on purpose," Geryon said. Will he try to get away from me, or what?" "Sometimes he'll try to run," Beric said, "but I wouldn't count on it. More likely he'll try to split you up the middle with his tusks. At that point, it's usually a good idea to climb a tree." "I'll remember that," Geryon said. "I won't be far away if you have trouble," Beric promised, handing Geryon a pair of heavy spears. Then he trudged back to his sleigh and they all galloped off, leaving Geryon standing alone under the large oak tree. It was shadowy among the dark tree's trunks, and bitingly cold. Geryon walked around for a bit through the snow, looking for the best place to await the boar. The trail Beric had pointed out was a beaten path, winding back through the dark brush, and Geryon found the size of the tracks imprinted in the snow on the path alarmingly large. The oak tree with the low spreading limbs began to look very inviting, but he dismissed that thought angrily. He was expected to stand on the ground and meet the charge of the boar, and he decided he would rather die than hide in a tree like a frightened child. The dry voice in his mind advised him that he spent far too much time worrying about things like that. Until he was grown, no one would consider him a man, so why should he go to all the trouble of trying to seem brave when it wouldn't do any good anyway? The forest was very quiet now, and the snow muffled all sounds. No bird sang, and there was only an occasional padded thump of snow sliding from overloaded branches to the earth beneath. Garion felt terribly alone. What was he doing here? What business had a good, sensible Sendarian boy here in the endless forest of Sherrick, awaiting the charge of a savage wild pig with only a pair of unfamiliar spears for company? What had the pig ever done to him? He realized he didn't even particularly like the taste of pork. He was some distance from Let's try that again. He was some distance from the beaten forest track along which the sleighs had passed, and he set his back to the oak tree, shivered, and waited. He didn't realize how long he'd been listening to the sound when he became fully aware of it. It was not the stamping, squealing rush of a wild boar he'd been expecting, but was rather the measured pace of several horses, moving slowly along the snow-carpeted floor of the forest, and it was coming from behind him. Cautiously, he eased his face around the tree. 3 riders, muffled in furs, emerged from the woods on the far side of the sleigh-churned track. They stopped and sat waiting. 2 of them were bearded warriors, little different from dozens of others Garion had seen in King Enheg's palace. The third man, however, had long flaxen-colored hair and wore no beard. His face had the sullen, pampered look of a spoiled child, although he was a man of middle years, and he sat his horse disdainfully, as if the company of the other 2 somehow offended him. After a time, the sound of another horse came from near the edge of the forest. Almost holding his breath, Garion waited. The other rider slowly approached the 3 who sat their horses in the snow at the edge of the trees. It was the sandy-bearded man in the green cloak whom Garion had seen creeping through the passages of King Enheg's palace 2 nights before. "My lord," the green-cloaked man said deferentially as he joined the other 3. "Where have you been?" the flaxen-haired man demanded. "Lord Berwick took some of his guests on a boar hunt this morning. His route was the same as mine, and I didn't want to follow too closely." The nobleman grunted sourly. "We saw them deeper in the woods," he said. "Well, what have you heard?" "Very little, my lord. The kings are meeting with the old man and the woman in a guarded chamber. I can't get close enough to hear what they're saying." "I'm paying you good gold to get close enough. I have to know what they're saying. Go back to the palace and work out a way to hear what they're talking about." "I'll try, my lord," the green-cloaked man said, bowing somewhat stiffly. "You'll do more than try," the flaxen-haired man snapped. "As you wish, my lord," the other said, starting to turn his horse. "Wait," the nobleman commanded. "Were you able to meet with our friend?" "Your friend, my lord," the other corrected with distaste. "I met him, and we went to a tavern and talked a little." "What did he say?" "Nothing very useful. His kind seldom do." "Will he meet us as he said he would?" "He told me that he would. If you want to believe him, that's your affair." The nobleman ignored that. "Who arrived with the king of the Sendars?" "The old man and the woman, another old man, some Sendarian noble, I think, Lord Berwick and a weasel-faced Drasnian, and another Sendar, a commoner of some sort." "That's all? Wasn't there a boy with them as well?" The spy shrugged. "I didn't think the boy was important," he said. "He's there, then, in the palace?" "He is, my lord. An ordinary Sendarian boy of about 14, I'd judge. He seems to be some kind of servant to the woman." "Very well. Go back to the palace and get close enough to that chamber to hear what the kings and the old man are saying." "That may be very dangerous, my lord." "It'll be more dangerous if you don't. Now go, before that ape Barrett comes back and finds you loitering here." He whirled his horse and, followed by his 2 warriors, plunged back into the forest on the far side of the snowy track that wound among the dark trees. The man in the green cloak sat grimly watching for a moment. Then he too soon turned his horse and rode back the way he came. Garion rose from his crouched position behind the tree. His hands were clenched so tightly around the shaft of his spear that they actually ached. This had gone entirely too far, he decided. The matter must be brought to someone's attention. And then, some way off in the snowy depths of the wood, he heard the sound of hunting horns, and the steely clash of swords ringing rhythmically on shields. The huntsmen were coming, driving all the beasts of the forest before them. He heard a crackling in the bushes, and a great stag bounded into view. His eyes wild with fright and his antlers flaring above his head. With 3 huge leaps he was gone. Garion trembled with excitement. Then there was a squealing rush, and a red-eyed sow plunged from the trail, followed by a half-dozen scampering piglets. Garion stepped behind the tree and let them pass. The next squeals were deeper and rang less with fright than with rage. It was the boar. Garion knew that before the beast even broke out of the heavy brush. When the boar appeared, Garion felt his heart quail. This was no fat, sleepy porker, but rather a savage, infuriated beast. The horrid tusks jutting up past the flaring snout were yellow, and bits of twigs and bark clung to them, mute evidence that the boar would slash at anything in his path, trees, bushes, or a Sendarian boy without sense enough to get out of the way. Then a peculiar thing happened. As in the long-ago fight with Runderig, or in the scuffle with Brill's hireman in the dark streets of Muros. Garion felt his blood begin to surge, and there was a wild ringing in his ears. He seemed to hear a defiant shouted challenge that could scarcely accept the fact that it came from his own throat. He suddenly realized that he was stepping into the middle of the trail and crouching with his spear braced and leveled at the massive beast. The boar charged, red-eyed and frothing from the mouth. With a deep-throated squeal of fury, he plunged at the waiting Garion. The powdery snow sprayed up from his churning hooves like foam from the prow of a ship. The snow crystals seemed to hang in the air, sparkling in a single ray of sunlight that chanced just to reach the forest floor. The shock as the boar hit the spear was frightful, but Garion's aim was good. The broad-bladed spearhead penetrated the coarsely haired chest, and the white froth dripping from the boar's tusks suddenly became bloody foam. Garion felt himself driven back by the impact, his feet slipping out from under him, and then the shaft of the spear snapped like a dry twig and the boar was on him. The first slashing, upward ripping blow of the boar's tusks took Garion full in the stomach, and he felt the wind whoosh out of his lungs. The second slash caught his hip as he tried to roll, gasping out of the way. His chainmail shirt deflected the tusks, saving him from being wounded, but the blows were stunning. The boar's third slash caught him in the back, and he was flung through the air and crashed into a tree. His eyes filled with shimmering light as his head banged against the rough bark. And then Beric was there, roaring and charging through the snow, but somehow it seemed not to be Beric. Garion's eyes, glazed from the shock of the blow to his head, looked uncomprehendingly at something that could not be true. It was Beric, there could be no doubt of that, but it was also something else. Oddly, as if somehow occupying the same space as Beric, there was also a huge, hideous bear. The images of the two figures crashing through the snow were superimposed, their movements identical, as if sharing the same space they also shared the same thoughts. Huge arms grasped up the wriggling, mortally wounded boar and crushed in upon it. Bright blood fountained from the boar's mouth, and the shaggy, half-man thing that seemed to be Beric and something else at the same time raised the dying pig and smashed it brutally to the ground. The man-thing lifted its awful face and roared in earth-shaking triumph as the light slid away from Garion's eyes and he felt himself drifting down into the grey well of unconsciousness. There was no way of knowing how much time passed until he came to in the sleigh. Silk was applying a cloth filled with snow to the back of his neck as they flew across the glaring white fields toward Valalorum. "I see that you've decided to live," Silk grinned at him. "Where's Beric?" Garion mumbled groggily. "In the sleigh behind us," Silk said, glancing back. "Is he all right?" "What could hurt Beric?" Silk asked. "I mean, does he seem like himself?" "Seems like Beric to me," Silk shrugged. "No, boy, lie still. That wild pig may have cracked your ribs." He placed his hands on Garion's chest and gently laid him down. "My boar," Garion demanded weakly. "Where is it?" "The huntsmen are bringing it," Silk said. "You'll get your triumphal entry. If I might suggest it, however, you should give some thought to the virtue of constructive cowardice. These instincts of yours could shorten your life." But Garion had already slipped back into unconsciousness. And then they were in the palace, and Beric was carrying him, and Aunt Paul was there, white-faced at the sight of all the blood. "It's not his," Beric assured her quickly. "He speared a boar and then it bled on him while they were tussling. I think the boy's all right. A little rap on the head is all." "Bring him," Aunt Paul said curtly, and led the way up the stairs toward Garion's room. Later, with his head and chest wrapped in a foul-tasting cup of Aunt Paul's brewing, making him light-headed and sleepy, Garion lay in his bed listening as Aunt Paul finally turned on Beric. You great overgrown dolt," she raged. "Do you see what all your foolishness has done?" "The lad's very brave," Beric said, his voice low and sunk in a kind of oblique melancholy. "Brave doesn't interest me," Aunt Paul snapped. Then she stopped. "What's the matter with you?" she demanded. She reached out suddenly and put her hands on the sides of the huge man's head. She looked for a moment into his eyes and then slowly released him. "Oh," she said softly. "It's finally happened, I see." "I couldn't control it, Polgara," Beric said in misery. "It'll be all right, Beric," she said, gently touching his bowed head. "It'll never be all right again," Beric said. "Get some sleep," she told him. "It won't seem so bad in the morning." The huge man turned and quietly left the room. Garion knew that they were talking about the strange thing he'd seen when Beric had rescued him from the boar, and he wanted to ask Aunt Paul about it, but the bitter drink she'd given him pulled him down into a deep and dreamless sleep before he could put the words together to ask the question. Alright, I'm thinking we mainly can... I'm thinking we probably have enough left in me for maybe one more chapter. I know we're getting pretty close to the end of the book. Too much to finish in this session, as we've already been going for a couple of hours now. But we'll definitely finish this up next time. Might even be a pretty short session next time. Unless I do something stupid like picking up the second book when I'm halfway through. Alright. Chapter 16. The next day, Garion was too stiff and sore to even think about getting out of bed. A stream of visitors, however, kept him too occupied to think about his aches and pains. The visits from the Aloran kings in their splendid robes were particularly flattering, and each of them praised his courage. Then the queens came and made a great fuss over his injuries, offering warm sympathy and gentle stroking touches to his forehead. The combination of praise, sympathy, and the certain knowledge that he was the absolute center of attention was overwhelming, and his heart was full. The last visitor of the day, however, was Mr. Wolf, who came when evening was creeping through the snowy streets of Valalorum. The old man wore his usual tunic and cloak, and his hood was turned up as if he'd been outside. "Have you seen my boar, Mr. Wolf?" Garion asked proudly. "An excellent animal," Wolf said, though without much enthusiasm. "But didn't anyone tell you it's customary to jump out of the way after the boar's been speared?" "I didn't really think about it," Garion admitted. "But wouldn't that seem, well, cowardly?" "Were you that concerned about what a pig might think of you?" "Well," Garion faltered, "not really, I guess." "You're developing an amazing lack of good sense for one so young," Wolf observed. "It normally takes years and years to reach the point you seem to have arrived at overnight." He turned to Aunt Paul, who sat nearby. "Polgara, are you quite certain there's no hint of Orandish blood in Argarion's background? He's been behaving most Orandish lately. First he rides the great maelstrom like a rocking horse. Then he tries to break a wild boar's tusks with his ribs. Are you sure you didn't drop him on his head when he was a baby?" Aunt Paul smiled, but said nothing. "I hope you recover soon, boy," Wolf said, "and try to give some thought to what I've said." Garion sulked, mortally offended by Mr. Wolf's words. Tears welled up in his eyes despite his best efforts to control them. "Thank you for stopping by, Father," Aunt Paul said. "It's always a pleasure to call on you, my daughter," Wolf said as he quietly left the room. "Why did he have to talk to me like that?" Garion burst out, wiping his nose. "Now he's gone and spoiled it all." "Spoiled what, dear?" Aunt Paul asked, smoothing the front of her grey dress. "All of it," Garion complained. "The kings all said I was very brave." "Kings say things like that," Aunt Paul said. "I wouldn't pay too much attention if I were you." "I was brave, wasn't I?" "I'm sure you were, dear," she said. "And I'm sure the pig was very impressed." "You're as bad as Mr. Wolf is," Garion accused. "Yes, dear," she said. "I suppose I probably am. But that's only natural. Now what would you like for supper?" "I'm not hungry," Garion said defiantly. "Really? You probably need a tonic then. I'll fix you one." "I think I've changed my mind," Garion said quickly. "I rather thought you might," Aunt Paul said, and then without explanation she suddenly put her arms around him and held him close to her for a long time. "What am I going to do with you?" she said finally. "I'm all right, Aunt Paul," she assured her. "This time, perhaps," she said, taking his face between her hands. "It's a splendid thing to be brave, my Garion, but once in a while try to think a little bit first. Promise me." "All right, Aunt Paul," he said, a little embarrassed by all this. Oddly enough, she still acted as if she really cared about him. The idea that there could still be a bond between them, even if they weren't related, began to dawn on him. It could never be the same, of course, but at least it was something. He began to feel a little better about the whole thing. The next day he was able to get up. His muscles still ached a bit, and his ribs were somewhat tender, but he was young and was healing fast. About mid-morning he was sitting with Dernick in the great hall of Anheg's palace when the silvery-bearded Earl of Selene approached them. "King Florok wonders if you'd be so kind as to join us in the council chamber, Goodman Dernick," he said politely. "Me, Your Honor?" Dernick asked incredulously. "His Majesty is most impressed with your sensibility," the old gentleman said. "He feels you represent the very best of Sendarian practicality. What we face involves all men, not just kings of the West, and so it's only proper that good, solid common sense be represented in our proceedings." "I'll come at once, Your Honor," Dernick said, getting up quickly. "But you'll have to forgive me if I say very little." Garion waited expectantly. "We've all heard of your adventure, my boy," the Earl of Selene said pleasantly to Garion. "Ah, to be young again," he sighed. "Coming, Dernick?" "Immediately, Your Honor," Dernick said, and the two of them made their way out of the great hall toward the council chamber. Garion sat alone, wounded to the quick by his exclusion. He was at an age where his self-esteem was very tender, and inwardly he writhed at the lack of regard implicit in his not being invited to join them. Hurt and offended, he sulkily left the great hall and went to visit the boar which hung in an ice-filled cooling room just off the kitchen. At least the boar had taken him seriously. One could, however, spend only so much time in the company of a dead pig without becoming depressed. The boar didn't seem nearly so big as he had when he was alive and charging, and the tusks were impressive, but neither so long nor so sharp as Garion remembered them. Besides, it was cold in the cooling room, and sore muscles stiffened quickly in chilly places. There was no point in trying to visit Beric. The red-bearded man had locked himself in his chamber to brood in blackest melancholy, and refused to answer his door, even to his wife. And so Garion, left entirely on his own, moped about for a while, and then decided he might as well explore the vast palace with its dusty, unused chambers and dark, twisting corridors. He walked for what seemed like hours, opening doors and following hallways that sometimes ended abruptly against blank stone walls. The palace of Anheg was enormous, having been, as Beric had explained, some 3,000 years and more in its construction. One southern wing was so totally abandoned that its entire roof had fallen in centuries ago. Garion wandered there for a time in the second-floor corridors of the ruin, his mind filled with gloomy thoughts of mortality and transient glory as he looked into rooms where snow lay thickly on ancient beds and stools, and the tiny tracks of mice and squirrels ran everywhere. And then he came to an unroofed corridor where there were other tracks, those of a man. The footprints were quite fresh, for there was no sign of snow in them, and it had snowed heavily the night before. At first he thought the tracks might be his own, and that he'd somehow circled and come back to a corridor he'd already explored, but the footprints were much larger than his. There were a dozen possible explanations, of course, but Garion felt his breath quicken. The man in the green cloak was still lurking about the palace. Asherak the Murgo was somewhere in Valaloran, and the flaxen-haired nobleman was hiding somewhere in the forest with obviously unfriendly intentions. Garion realized that the situation might be dangerous, and that he was unarmed except for a small dagger. He retraced his steps quickly to a snowy chamber he'd just explored, and took down a rusty sword from a peg where it had hung forgotten for uncountable years. Then, feeling a bit more secure, he returned to follow the silent tracks. So long as the path of the unknown intruder lay in the roofless and long-abandoned corridor, following him was simplicity itself. The undisturbed snow made tracking easy, but once the trail led over a heap of fallen debris and into the gaping blackness of a dusty corridor where the roof was still intact, things became a bit more difficult. The dust on the floor helped, but it was necessary to do a great deal of stooping and bending over. Garion's ribs and legs were still sore, and he winced and grunted each time he had to bend down to examine the stone floor. In a very short while he was sweating and gritting his teeth, and thinking about giving the whole thing up. Then he heard a faint sound far down the corridor ahead. He shrunk back against the wall, hoping that no light from behind him would filter dimly through to allow him to be seen. Far ahead, a figure passed stealthily through the pale light of a single tiny window. Garion caught a momentary flicker of green, and knew finally whom he was following. He kept close to the wall, and moved with cat-like silence in his soft leather shoes. The rusty sword gripped tightly in his hand. If it had not been for the startling nearness of the voice of the Earl of Selene, however, he would probably have walked directly into the man he'd been following. "Is it at all possible, noble Belgariad, that our enemy can be awakened before all the conditions of the ancient prophecy are met?" the Earl was asking. Garion stopped. Directly ahead of him, in a narrow embrasure in the wall of the corridor, he caught sight of a slight movement. The green-cloaked man lurked there, listening in the dimness to the words that seemed to come from somewhere beneath. Garion shrank back against the wall, scarcely daring to breathe. Carefully he stepped backward until he found another embrasure, and drew himself into the concealing darkness. "A most appropriate question, Belgariad," the quiet voice of Cohag of the Algars said. "Can this apostate use the power now in his hands to revive the accursed one?" "The power's there," the familiar voice of Mr. Wolf said, "but he might be afraid to use it. If it isn't done properly, the power will destroy him. He won't rush into such an act, but he'll think carefully before he tries it. It's that hesitation that gives us the little bit of time we have." Then Silk spoke. "Didn't you say he might want the thing for himself?" Maybe he plans to leave his master in undisturbed slumber and use the power he's stolen to rise himself as king of the lands of the Angarak. King Rodar of Drasny chuckled. Somehow I don't see this Grollam priesthood as easily relinquishing their power in the lands of Angarak and bowing down to an outsider. The high priest of the Grollams is no mean sorcerer himself, I'm told. Forgive me, Rodar, King Enheg said. But if the power is in the thief's hands, the Grollams won't have any choice but to accept his dominion. I've studied the power of the thing, and if even half of what I've read is true, he can use it to rip down Rakthal as easily as you'd kick apart an anthill. Then if they still resist, he could depopulate all of Thal Murgos from Rakgoska to the Tolnardon border. No matter what, however, whether it's the apostate or the accursed one who eventually raises that power, the Angaraks will follow and they will come west. Shouldn't we inform the Arons and the Tolnardons, and the Ulgos as well, what's happened then? Brand the Riven warder asked. Let's not be taken by surprise again. I wouldn't be in too much hurry to raise our southern neighbors, Mr. Wolf said. When Paul and I leave here, we'll be moving south. If Arendia and Tolnadra are mobilizing for war, the general turmoil would only hinder us. The Emperor's legions are soldiers. They can respond quickly when the need arises, and the Arons are always ready for war. The whole kingdom hovers on the brink of general warfare all the time. It's premature, Aunt Paul's familiar voice agreed. Armies would just get in the way of what we're trying to do. If we can apprehend my father's old pupil and return the thing he pilfered to Riva, the crisis will be past. Let's not stir up the Southerners for nothing. She's right, Wolf said. Just one second, my screen went black for a moment, just waiting for it to catch up. Alright, there we go. It's premature, Aunt Paul's familiar voice agreed. Armies would just get in the way of what we're trying to do. If we can apprehend my father's old pupil and return the thing he pilfered to Riva, the crisis will be past. Let's not stir up the Southerners for nothing. She's right, Wolf said. There's always a risk in mobilization. A king with an army on his hands often begins to think of mischief. I'll advise the king of the Arons at Volmember and the emperor at Tolhanath of as much as they need to know as I pass through. But we should get word to the Gorum of Olgo. Kohag, do you think you could get a messenger through to Proglu at this time of year? It's hard to say, Ancient One, Kohag said. The passes to those mountains are difficult in the winter. I'll try, though. Good, Wolf said. Beyond that, there's not much more we can do. For the time being, it might not be a bad idea to keep this matter in the family, so to speak. If worse comes to worst, and the Angaraks invade again, Aloria at least will be armed and ready. There will be time for Arendia and the Empire to make their preparations. King Fulrak spoke in a troubled voice. It's easy for the Alorn kings to talk of war, he said. Alorns are warriors, but my Sendaria is a peaceful kingdom. We don't have castles or fortified keeps, and my people are farmers and tradesmen. Kal Torak made a mistake when he chose the battlefield at Volmember, and it's not likely that the Angaraks will make the same mistake again. I think they'll strike directly across the grasslands of northern Algaria and fall upon Sendaria. We've got a lot of food and very few soldiers. Our country would provide an ideal base for a campaign in the west, and I'm afraid we'd fall quite easily. Then, to Garian's amazement, Dernick spoke. Don't cheapen the men of Sendaria so, Lord King, he said in a firm voice. I know my neighbors, and they'll fight. We don't know very much about swords and lances, but we'll fight. If the Angaraks come to Sendaria, they won't find the taking as easy as some might imagine, and if we put torches to the fields and storehouses, there won't be all that much food for them to eat. There was a long silence. And then Fulrak spoke in a strangely humble voice. Your words shame me, Goodman Dernick, he said. Maybe I've been a king for so long I've forgotten what it means to be a Sendar. One remembers there are only a few passes leading through the western escarpment into Sendaria. Oh, that's the wrong person. I thought that was Kohag. One remembers there are only a few passes leading through the western escarpment into Sendaria, Hetar, the son of King Kohag, said quietly. A few avalanches in the right places could make Sendaria as inaccessible as the moon. If the avalanches took place at the right times, whole armies of Angaraks might find themselves trapped in those narrow corridors. Now that's an entertaining thought, Silk chuckled. Then we could let Dernick put his incendiary impulses to a better use than burning turnip patches. Since Torak One-Eye seems to enjoy the smell of burning sacrifices so much, we might be able to accommodate him. Far down the dusty passages in which he was hiding, Garian caught the sudden flicker of a torch and heard the faint jingling of several mail shirts. He almost failed to recognize the danger until the last instant. The man in the green cloak also heard the sounds and saw the light of the torch. He stepped from his hiding place and fled back the way he'd come, directly past the embrasure where Garion had concealed himself. Garion shrank back, clutching his rusty sword. But as luck had it, the man was looking back over his shoulder at the twinkling torch as he ran by on its soft feet. As soon as he'd passed, Garion also slipped out of his hiding place and fled. The Sherrick warriors were looking for intruders, and it might be difficult to explain what he was doing in the dark hallway. He briefly considered following the spy again, but decided he'd had enough of that for one day. It was time to tell someone about the things he'd seen. Someone had to be told, someone to whom the kings would listen. Once he reached the more frequented corridors of the palace, he firmly began to make his way toward the chamber where Beric brooded in silent melancholy. Alright, I think that's probably enough for one day. I'm feeling that telltale little scratch at the back of my throat that tells me I've used it enough for the moment. I would really like to continue reading on. It is such a hard decision for me to put this book down right now because we're only another 40 or 50 pages from the end of this first one. But that would be probably about another 45 minutes or an hour to finish up, and that's more than my voice has in it. And I would feel really silly leaving off the book 10 pages from the end. That's just nonsense. So I'm gonna wrap it up here, and I think give myself a bit of a break and get something to eat and find something else to do for the evening. But thank you all for joining me tonight. It's been lovely having you here, listening to the story, sharing one of my favorite novels with me. So I'll do another of these before too long, probably sometime on the weekend. I'll find some time to do another session and finish up on a prophecy and maybe even move on to the next one. But in the meantime, cheers, you all have a great evening, and I'll catch you again later. Bye-bye.